Imagine walking into a medieval town with freshly washed hair, clean fingernails, and a scent that doesn't suggest, "I wrestled a goat and lost." Congratulations, you've just made everyone uncomfortable. In the medieval mindset, cleanliness wasn't a sign of good manners or self-care. It was a warning flag, the olfactory equivalent of wearing a sign that said, "I might be dangerous, wealthy, foreign, or worst of all, fashionable." Being noticeably clean made people suspicious because almost no one had the luxury or the interest to look or smell that way. If your skin didn't have a healthy seasoning of dust, sweat, and whatever drifted in from the street, they wondered what game you were playing. Before we step into a medieval world where cleanliness was often feared rather than embraced, take a moment to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story. Now let's begin. Medieval society valued predictability. People liked you to look like you belonged to your class, your job, and your lifestyle. And smelling like a field after rainfall absolutely did not match the expectations for anyone who lived in a world where hard labour and crowded towns were the norm. If you seemed unusually fresh, people didn't think, "Wow, impressive hygiene." No, they thought, either you weren't working hard today, or you're concealing something that definitely isn't God approved. It was the same energy as showing up to a potluck with a dish so fancy everyone assumes you didn't make it yourself. Cleanliness also carried political baggage. Foreign traders, particularly those from regions with established bathing cultures, often arrived cleaner and better scented than locals. That alone was enough to stir suspicion. Anything foreign was automatically filed under maybe evil, but let's wait and see. If you smelled like imported rose oil rather than village musk, you risked being associated with untrustworthy outsiders, heretical ideas, or worst of all, people who read books. And in a society that feared unfamiliar influences, smelling like a spice market instead of a barnyard was a PR nightmare. Even the church added to the suspicion. While Christianity didn't ban washing outright, it certainly didn't prioritize it, and a person who seemed too clean risked appearing vain. Vanity was a slippery slope that began with scented oils and ended apparently with moral collapse. If you were clean, some assumed you must be spending too much time on your body and not enough on your soul, and if you were too clean, well, there were only two possible explanations. Either you had something to hide, or you were trying to attract attention you definitely shouldn't be attracting. Cleanliness didn't hint at holiness, it hinted at trouble. And then there was the practical politics of fitting in. Medieval life was steeped in hierarchy. Lords were expected to appear noble, peasants to appear worn down, craftsmen to appear perpetually powdered with the debris of their trade. Dirt wasn't just dirt, it was a uniform. A blacksmith without soot was like a baker without flour, suspiciously un-baker-like. If you stood out visually or aromatically, people wondered if you were pretending to be something you weren't. Cleanliness could look like an attempt to impersonate a higher class, which was risky business in a world that took social roles as seriously as death and taxes. Even beyond class suspicion, cleanliness was associated with idleness. Nobody respected someone who clearly had the free time to scrub themselves regularly. Time spent bathing was time spent not surviving. If you were spotless, you were either wealthy enough to avoid manual labour, which made peasants resent you, or lazy enough to avoid work, which made everyone resent you. A clean person walking through town wasn't seen as admirable. They were seen as someone who mysteriously had time to spare, which meant they were either useless or dangerous. Medieval people didn't need a detective, they needed dirt. Daily life also created expectations for how a normal person should appear. If someone showed up without the usual collection of smoke, sweat, kitchen grease, animal scents, and street dust, they looked strangely sterilized. People feared the unfamiliar, and nothing was more unfamiliar than a person who smelled better than the environment. When your surroundings constantly announced themselves through smell, a human who didn't follow the same rules looked unnatural, like a bird that meowed. Technically possible, extremely concerning. And finally, medieval cities were rumour factories. A clean person was excellent gossip fuel. People whispered, "Why is he washed? Who is she trying to impress? What ritual is he preparing for? Has she been meeting suspicious strangers?" Cleanliness wasn't interpreted as "this person cares about hygiene." It was, "This person is planning something, and whatever it is, I don't trust it." Dirt blended you into the crowd. Cleanliness put a spotlight on you, and not the flattering kind. The interrogation begins at sunrise kind. So in the medieval world, being dirty wasn't just normal, it was safe, expected, socially stabilizing. Cleanliness, meanwhile, was a disruptor, a behavior that sent signals no one liked receiving. If you walked through town looking clean, you weren't admired. You were a mystery. And in the Middle Ages, mysteries were rarely rewarded. Because the truth was simple. If you smelled nice, people assumed you were up to something. And usually, they were right to worry, because only someone with a plan had time to wash. If you live in the modern world, you probably think of water as a loyal friend. Hydration, cleansing, the thing that prevents strangers from inching away from you in public spaces. But in the medieval mind, water was a suspicious acquaintance at best. It looked innocent, sure, but only the foolish trusted something that could drown you, chill you, rot your timber, ruin your bread dough, wash away your roof thatch, and, most importantly, sneak into your pores like a tiny burglar carrying diseases instead of loot. To medieval people, water wasn't refreshing. It was a risk you willingly walked into, like sticking your head inside the mouth of a very polite wolf and hoping for the best. Medical theory didn't help. The popular belief of the time was that your skin wasn't a barrier. It was more like a perforated membrane. A medieval body wasn't sealed. It was a collection of tiny openings waiting for trouble to slip inside. Doctors agreed that pores opened when the body was warm, which bathing conveniently caused. And once those pores yawned wide open like bored students in a lecture, bad air and dangerous vapours were free to march right in. You weren't washing away illness. You were giving it a guided tour of your circulatory system. Water didn't clean you. It invited guests. And what kind of guests? Well, medieval people believed disease travelled through miasma, corrupted air, foul vapours, the atmospheric equivalent of a demon leaning in too close. Step into hot water, steaming happily around you, and congratulations. You just created a perfect gateway for those unseen horrors to invade your suddenly vulnerable flesh. Bathing didn't protect you from sickness. Bathing practically rolled out a red carpet for it. In fact, many physicians advised their patients to avoid water specifically during times of epidemic, because a bath was basically a handshake with the Grim Reaper. Even when disease wasn't the issue, temperature was. Medieval water wasn't piped conveniently into your house like a domesticated river. It came from wells, streams, ponds, rain barrels, or buckets carried by someone whose job satisfaction rarely peaked. Cold water shocked the body, and hot water weakened it, or so the thinking went. Either way, a bath destabilized your carefully balanced humours, and nobody wanted their humours destabilized. Your inner fluids, your black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, were supposed to remain in a gentle, harmonious quarrel. Dramatically changing your body's temperature by bathing was viewed as reckless, like rearranging furniture in a house where the walls are already leaning. Another problem? Water was rarely clean to begin with. Medieval streams doubled as transportation systems for several categories of waste, and wells were not immune to contamination from just about everything nearby, including livestock, household runoff, or your friendly neighbourhood tannery. People saw water clouded, murky, filled with floating mysteries and occasional uninvited wildlife. Even if water didn't deliver airborne disease through your pores, it could certainly deliver other contributions. Bathing in water was sometimes less like cleansing and more like marinating in the town's collective problems. And then there was the chilling logic of self-preservation through dryness. Staying dry meant staying strong. A dry body held its warmth, its vigour, and its protective, natural heat. Lose that heat, and your defenses collapsed faster than a medieval bridge in a rainstorm. Water sapped energy, stole warmth, and left you vulnerable, not just to illness, but to fatigue and weakness. A person who bathed often wasn't admired. They were pitied. Clearly they had no idea what they were doing to themselves. Bathing also disrupted sweat, which medieval people considered essential for releasing superfluities, the extra materials that the body had to expel. Sweat was a purification method, one far superior to water. Soaking yourself in a tub halted this natural process, trapped dangerous materials inside, and risked internal imbalance. Bathing wasn't hygienic. It was meddling with bodily functions you didn't fully understand. To medieval thinking, your body knew what it was doing. You, sadly, did not. Even water's physical behavior inspired suspicion. It moved unpredictably. It flooded. It stagnated. It hid things. It reflected light in unsettling ways. Whole villages could drown in a single storm, yet water could also vanish in droughts as if personally offended. A substance so moody was not to be trusted anywhere near your pores. And remember, bathing was optional. Nobody needed to explain why they didn't do it. It was the bath lovers who owed society an explanation. Finally, for the average medieval person, staying alive consumed so much energy that willingly stepping into danger, no matter how warm and soothing the bath, felt irresponsible. When survival depended on prudence, not indulgence, the bath became a luxury only the reckless entertained. Why trust water when the world offered so many safer, drier, less pore-invading options? To the medieval mind, bathing wasn't refreshing, it wasn't cleansing, it wasn't relaxing, it was a delivery system, and the only thing being delivered was trouble. If you want to understand why medieval people resisted cleanliness with the enthusiasm of a cat avoiding bath time, you need to meet the real star of the era, humoral theory, the medical worldview that insisted your body was basically a simmering pot of elemental soup. This soup contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each with its own personality, temperature, and preferred dramatic flair. Staying healthy didn't mean keeping yourself clean. It meant keeping these 4 moody roommates in balance. And dirt, surprisingly, was considered a stabilizer, like a warm blanket over your internal cauldron of chaos. The logic went something like this. Every substance, every activity, and every part of the environment had qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry. Your body, too, leaned toward one or another. A physician's job wasn't to scrub you clean, but to keep these qualities from picking fights inside you. Cleanliness didn't even enter the conversation. In fact, washing too much was believed to alter your body's natural temperature or moisture levels, disrupting your fragile equilibrium. A bath might warm the skin, cool the inner organs, open the pores, or shift internal heat in dangerous ways. You weren't just washing dirt off, you were stirring the soup. Medieval people weren't reckless. They were following what sounded like solid medical advice at the time. A doctor might warn a patient, avoid excessive bathing, lest your humours scatter, and scatter they might. Hot baths were thought to loosen the body, letting humours escape or wander where they shouldn't. Cold water, on the other hand, risked trapping fluids, stiffening the flesh, and halting circulation. Cleanliness was practically a medical hazard. Why risk catastrophic soup imbalance just to look slightly less dusty? To keep the humours happy, physicians prescribed behavioural routines that made cleanliness a low priority. Moderation in diet, sleep, exercise, and emotional expression mattered far more. Eat too many warm foods, you risk overheating your blood. Experience too much grief, black bile might surge, get too angry. Yellow bile, the spice you never ordered, rises uninvited. Cleanliness was simply not essential to this worldview. Your dirt level had no emotional or thermal profile, so doctors barely addressed it. Dirt was neutral, dirt was harmless, dirt was safe. In fact, some believed dirt acted as an external buffer, protecting the body's natural heat. A thin layer of grime, what modern advertisers might euphemistically call a protective barrier, helped stabilize temperature. Dirt didn't disturb your humours, it politely minded its own business. Bathing, however, was like rearranging the furniture in a house where ghosts absolutely live and will absolutely complain about it. Because humoral medicine placed such emphasis on internal balance, physicians often treated disease by adjusting your environment rather than your hygiene. If someone was too hot, they recommended cooling foods or shady rest. Too cold, try warm wine or a cozy fire. Nobody said, take a bath. That was the kind of reckless suggestion that could land you with runaway phlegm or rebellious bile staging a coup. Better to stay dusty and balanced than clean and humoral chaos adjacent. And then there was the emotional component. Different humours produced different temperaments. Blood made you cheerful, phlegm made you calm, yellow bile made you fiery, and black bile made you philosophical, sometimes to a concerning degree. A bath could heighten or dull these temperaments by shifting the humoral balance. Too much cleanliness might even make you melancholy or irritable, at least according to medieval physicians, and nobody wanted to be the person who bathed their way into a bad mood. Practical health advice reinforced this. Doctors reminded patients that stability of temperature, diet, emotions, and habits was the foundation of wellness. Erratic behaviour produced erratic humours, and nothing was more erratic than voluntarily dunking yourself into unpredictable water. Washing too frequently was considered destabilising, unnatural, and medically unnecessary. If a doctor gave you permission to bathe, it usually came with a checklist. Not too hot, not too cold, not too long, not too soon after eating, not when tired, not when emotional, and ideally not unless you really had no other choice. Dirt, meanwhile, required no rules. Dirt was easy. Dirt kept your external temperature steady. Dirt didn't shock your body. Dirt didn't generate unexpected vapours. And most importantly, dirt didn't interfere with the body's essential processes. If anything, it signalled that you were living a grounded, wholesome life that didn't provoke the humours into misbehaviour. Being dirty didn't mean you were unhealthy. Being imbalanced meant you were unhealthy. And cleanliness, unfortunately, tended to cause imbalance. Humoral theory reigned for centuries because it offered a simple, structured worldview in a chaotic and unpredictable world. Sickness wasn't the result of invisible pathogens. It was the result of a heated argument between your internal ingredients. And if a little soil on your skin helped keep the peace, so be it. German doctors even recommended limiting baths to specific seasons, and only after careful preparation, because the risk of destabilizing the humours was far greater than the benefit of smelling less like your own daily efforts. So medieval people weren't avoiding cleanliness out of apathy. They were following medical science, or at least the science available at the time. They weren't being reckless, they were being responsible, and the core belief was unwavering. Health wasn't about being clean, it was about not upsetting your internal soup. If you truly want to appreciate why medieval people avoided baths, you have to step inside the most scandalous, eyebrow-raising, temptation-drenched place in town, the public bathhouse. Today, we think of bathhouses as serene spaces with warm steam, soft lighting, and maybe a eucalyptus scent if you're lucky. But in the medieval imagination, bathhouses were one incense stick away from becoming the devil's favourite meet-up spot. These weren't places for hygiene. These were places where morality got slippery, and not just because of the soap. For medieval moralists, the bathhouse posed two existential threats: nudity and pleasure. Either one alone was dangerous, together, a theological disaster. To church authorities, nothing attracted sin more efficiently than a room full of damp, unclothed humans relaxing in warm water with lowered inhibitions. Washing your body was fine in theory, but doing it publicly, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, often of the opposite sex in steamy, dimly lit rooms, that was a spiritual hazard wrapped in a wet towel. The church was already suspicious of human bodies, especially bodies uncovered intentionally, or uncovered anywhere except during childbirth or extreme medical emergency. Bathhouses insisted on nudity as part of the experience, transforming an ordinary health practice into a potential carnival of moral collapse. Medieval sermons warned of lust stirring in the steam, temptation lurking behind curtains, and sin floating atop the bathwater like a spiritual oil slick. And these warnings weren't entirely baseless, at least not in the medieval imagination. Bathhouses did earn reputations for permissiveness. While not all bathhouses were brothels, many brothels operated near or within bathing facilities, providing services that went far beyond cleaning your pores. Once the association took hold, the church lumped all bathhouses into the same category, places where soap and sin shared a changing room. To a devout Christian, bathing risked more than physical exposure, it risked moral exposure. Warm water was thought to relax the body and weaken discipline. A relaxed mind was a mind open to temptation, and temptation was a slippery slope, literally, if the floors were wet. The fear wasn't just that sin might happen, it was that people might enjoy themselves while bathing. Enjoyment, after all, was suspicious in itself. Medieval morality treated pleasure like a suspicious stranger, polite on the outside, wicked on the inside. The bathhouse atmosphere didn't help its reputation. They were lively social spaces where people ate, drank, talked, flirted, negotiated business deals, and occasionally forgot they were supposed to be maintaining solemn, God-fearing composure. There are medieval accounts of musicians performing in bathhouses, of patrons dining in the water, and of couples slipping away for private steaming sessions. To a priest, this wasn't bathing. This was a moral parade with no one wearing enough clothing. Even married couples were discouraged from bathing together, not because it was inherently sinful, but because public settings blurred boundaries. If a husband and wife entered together, who could guarantee that their eyes wouldn't wander? If they went separately, who could guarantee they wouldn't wander? Bathhouses created scenarios full of unmonitored interactions, and the medieval church preferred all interactions to be heavily monitored by God, clergy, or, ideally, both. And then came disease outbreaks, which moral authorities eagerly interpreted as divine commentary. When plagues and epidemics spread, many clergy preached that bathhouses had angered God by facilitating immoral behaviour. Illness wasn't caused by bacteria, which they didn't know existed. It was caused by sin, indulgence, and the failure to maintain proper spiritual boundaries. Dirt wasn't the issue. God was the issue. Bathhouses, therefore, became symbols of bodily indulgence that provoked heavenly displeasure. As a result, many towns regulated or outright banned bathhouses, especially during periods of heightened religious fervour. Ordinances limited operating hours, banned mixed bathing, or required bathhouses to display moral warnings. Imagine a medieval "no sinning beyond this point" sign, hung right above a steamy doorway. Even when rules relaxed, social suspicion remained strong. A person known to frequent the baths too often wasn't seen as health conscious. They were seen as morally risky, someone who couldn't resist the allure of warm water and potentially scandalous company. Private bathing also came under scrutiny. A person who seemed unusually intent on washing themselves raised eyebrows for the same reasons as public bathhouse customers. What exactly were they preparing for? Who were they planning to impress? And why, in God's name, were they enjoying themselves? Cleanliness, in certain contexts, wasn't interpreted as hygiene. It was interpreted as vanity. And vanity was the gateway sin to nearly everything else the church frowned upon. This wasn't purely paranoia. Well, it wasn't only paranoia. Bathhouses blended social mixing, sensuality, food, drink, music, and relaxation in an age that believed holiness thrived on restraint, discipline, and discomfort. What happened in the bathhouse didn't stay in the bathhouse. It followed you in the form of gossip, suspicion, and sometimes excommunication. So medieval people avoided baths not just to protect their bodies, but to protect their reputations and their souls. Why risk scandalizing the clergy, provoking divine wrath, or accidentally participating in sinful merriment when you could simply stay dry and morally stable. Besides, in the Middle Ages, cleanliness was dangerously close to fun, and fun, sadly, was not a cornerstone of medieval public health or medieval piety. If you lived in the medieval world and someone handed you a bar of soap, you probably wouldn't have known whether to wash with it, trade it, or throw it at an enemy. Soap existed, yes, but not in the reliable, pleasantly scented, neatly packaged form we're used to. Medieval soap was an unpredictable creature, sometimes useful, sometimes harsh, sometimes expensive, and sometimes so questionable that even people who wanted to be clean weren't convinced it should touch their skin. Soap wasn't part of daily life for most people, partly because it wasn't accessible, and partly because it simply hadn't earned society's trust. To start, soap wasn't cheap. Making soap required resources that ordinary households didn't typically have lying around. Animal fat, valuable, wood ash, usable but inconsistent, and enough time and skill to not accidentally create something corrosive. Soap making was closer to alchemy than household chore. A good batch could clean clothes, a bad batch could take the clothes with it. And skin? Well, let's just say medieval soap didn't aspire to moisturize. Soap at the time was often strong enough to remove stains, grease, and possibly your top layer of skin. Using that on your body felt less like hygiene and more like negotiation with a hostile substance. The soap that was gentle enough for skin typically came from regions with established traditions, like the famous Castile soap made with olive oil in Spain. But importing soap meant cost, and cost meant exclusivity. If you were wealthy, you might keep a few bars around as part of your grooming ritual, alongside your scented oils and fine linens. But if you were part of the 95% of society who spent their days working, sweating, and trying to avoid starvation, soap was something you heard rumours about, not something you purchased regularly. Even when soap was available locally, it varied wildly in quality. Town artisans who made soap often offered what was essentially industrial detergent, meant for scouring wool or cleaning pots. This wasn't Lavender Meadow Bliss soap. This was good luck, and may your hands survive the winter soap. Using it on your body was considered brave, foolish, or both. Many people decided dirt was preferable to the chemical experiment that medieval soap making produced. Cultural unfamiliarity also played a role. Soap wasn't woven into daily routines the way it is today. Medieval cleanliness methods relied on alternatives: dry rubbing with cloth, scraping the skin, using oils and then wiping them off, brushing hair vigorously, shaking out linens, or applying powders that absorbed odours. These were all trusted methods with centuries of tradition behind them. Soap, by comparison, was the strange new cousin at the family gathering, technically related but not someone you handed your children to. Soap also had image problems. For one, it smelled weird. Early soap carried strong scents from its ingredients: animal tallow, ash, lye, and whatever herbs or additives people used to mask the smell. If the makers used rancid fat, and they often did, then the soap carried a distinct aroma that was more barnyard adventure than fresh, clean start. Using it didn't guarantee you'd smell better afterward. It only guaranteed you'd smell different, and different was risky in a world deeply invested in predictable, familiar odours. Then there was the issue of religious and moral skepticism. Some clergy distrusted soap because it made bathing easier, and bathing, as we've already discussed, had a slightly scandalous reputation. Anything that encouraged people to wash themselves more often, enjoy the process, or show more concern for their physical appearance could lean dangerously toward vanity. Soap didn't cause sin, but it certainly greased the path. And anything that increased the pleasure of grooming hovered suspiciously near moral boundaries medieval people preferred not to test. Another obstacle: soap wasn't medically recommended. Physicians, guided by humoral theory, cared far more about balancing internal temperatures than about surface-level cleanliness. They didn't prescribe soap for health, and without medical endorsement, using it felt optional at best, unnecessary at worst. Why invest in an unusual product that neither doctor nor priest insisted you needed? Most importantly, soap did not yet represent the symbolic cleanliness we associate with it today. It wasn't a household staple. It wasn't a marker of responsibility. It didn't appear in every corner of daily life. Soap had no cultural weight. If you had it, fine. If you didn't, you weren't considered dirty. You were considered normal. Cleanliness was not measured by your proximity to soap, but by your ability to appear appropriately composed within your social class. Soap also had trouble competing with more appealing forms of personal care. Using scented oils, for example, was far more pleasant, far more luxurious, and far more familiar. Oils didn't strip the skin, and they made you smell like something deliberate rather than something accidental. Soap stung. Oils soothed. Soap washed things away. Oils added something pleasant. Which would you choose? In short, medieval people didn't avoid soap because they were indifferent to cleanliness. They avoided it because soap, in its early form, was inconvenient, inconsistent, expensive, harsh, smelly, and suspiciously modern. It was a newcomer in a world that loved tradition, and it offered a cleaning experience that felt more like a gamble than a guarantee. Soap would eventually rise to greatness, but in the Middle Ages it was still just an apprentice product. Useful in theory, questionable in practice, and far from universally trusted. After all, soap hadn't earned society's trust, and in medieval life, trust mattered far more than lather. If there is one thing absolutely guaranteed to shock a medieval visitor in the modern world, it would be the sheer number of outfits we own, and the unsettling habit of washing them constantly. In the Middle Ages, a wardrobe wasn't a walk-in closet. It was one or two garments trying their best to survive the decade. Clean clothes weren't part of daily life. They were a rare luxury, an event, a moment of triumph, like finally getting good weather on laundry day instead of the rain that had been personally stalking you for weeks. When a medieval person put on clean clothes, it wasn't routine. It was practically ceremonial. To start with, clothes were expensive, hugely expensive. Every garment represented hours of labour, growing flax or raising sheep, spinning fibres, weaving cloth, tailoring, stitching, reinforcing. A shirt wasn't something you picked up on sale. It was something you inherited and prayed wouldn't tear. Most people owned one set of everyday clothes and possibly one good set for church, weddings or funerals, if they were lucky enough to have two sets at all. If something ripped, you repaired it. If something stained, you tolerated it. Throwing clothes away was unthinkable unless they disintegrated in your hands, and sometimes even then you tried to salvage the sleeves, and if owning clothes was difficult, washing them was a whole different saga. Laundry wasn't a quick machine cycle. It was a multi-day ordeal that tested your strength, your patience, and your will to live. First, you had to gather water, lots of it. This could mean dragging buckets from a well, river, pond, or communal pump. Then you needed to heat that water, which required chopping wood, starting a fire, keeping that fire going, and not accidentally smoking everyone in the house. After that, you added lye or ashes to create a rudimentary cleaning solution strong enough to tackle stains, but not so strong it melted the fabric. And medieval washing's success rate on this point was not reassuring. Then came the scrubbing. Laundry was physically exhausting, involving beating, rubbing, soaking, wringing, and occasionally shouting at the garment, as though intimidation might help. Some linens were taken to fulling mills or public washhouses, where groups of women worked together, the atmosphere part teamwork, part therapy, and part open-air complaint festival. But even with cooperation, laundry was slow, heavy, and physically brutal, especially in winter, when cold water numbed your fingers into something resembling medieval laundry stones. Drying clothes added another challenge. There were no dryers, of course, just lines, bushes, fences, and every available surface. A sudden storm could undo an entire day's effort. The wind could steal your garments. Animals could trample or chew on them. And the sun? The sun worked slowly, like a medieval bureaucrat, eventually effective, but only after testing your patience. Because washing clothes required such extreme effort, people did it sparingly. Weekly laundry was unimaginable. Monthly laundry was ambitious. Seasonal laundry was more realistic, especially for large households. Even noble families with servants to do the work washed garments less often than modern people might imagine. Clothing simply wasn't expected to be spotless. It was expected to be functional. A bit of dirt meant you were alive and working. Spotless clothes meant either you'd done nothing, or you'd only just recovered from whatever dramatic life event required a washing. The scarcity of garments also meant that clothes were worn until they were undeniably dirty enough that wearing them one more day might make even your fellow medieval townsfolk raise an eyebrow. And medieval tolerance for grime was impressive. A shirt had to endure sweat, smoke, cooking fumes, dust, straw, random weather events, and the general texture of medieval life before anyone declared, "All right, fine, it's time." Even underwear, rare as it was, followed the same rule. Linen undergarments for those wealthy enough to own them were washed more frequently than outer garments. But more frequently in medieval terms meant something closer to occasionally, not after every wear. The average labourer likely had no underwear at all, which certainly simplified the laundry schedule. And let's not forget smell. Clothes absorbed odours like historical sponges, but because everyone smelled similarly, the background fragrance of the Middle Ages was a combination of wood smoke, sweat, animals and hope. Nobody expected clothing to smell fresh. Freshness was suspicious. Freshness meant soap. Freshness meant baths. Freshness meant behaviour that suggested you had the time and the money to fuss over things other people simply endured. Clean clothes were less a hygiene statement and more a socio-economic announcement. Even when medieval people wanted cleaner clothes, there were practical limits. Washing risked damaging fabric, stretching seams, weakening threads, and fading colours. Every wash shortened a garment's lifespan, and replacing clothing was financially painful. So many people followed a completely sensible strategy. Preserve the clothes, sacrifice the freshness. There was always next season's laundry day, assuming the world didn't end before then. And so, in a world where clothes were precious, washing was grueling, and expectations were low, clean clothes became something rare, meaningful, and sometimes even emotional. Putting on a freshly washed shirt wasn't just refreshing, it was almost revelatory. Clean clothes said, "Today is different. Today is important. Today I have accomplished something extraordinary." Because in the Middle Ages, clean shirts were special occasions, and the labour behind them could make even a saint consider swearing. In the medieval world, dirt wasn't just something you accumulated, it was something you earned. A streak of mud on your tunic, soot on your cheeks, straw in your hair, or the faint aroma of livestock following you around like a loyal and slightly judgmental companion. All of it said something about who you were and what you contributed to society. Today, people show off resumes filled with job titles and bullet points. In the Middle Ages, your resume was on your skin, your clothes, and occasionally stuck under your fingernails. Dirt told the world you belonged. Dirt meant you worked. Dirt meant you mattered. For the vast majority of medieval people, labour wasn't something you scheduled around your hobbies. It was life. Fields needed ploughing, animals needed tending, bread needed baking, thatch needed repairing, grain needed grinding, fires needed stoking, and children needed wrangling before they wandered into ponds or into your only supply of dried beans. Work was relentless, physical, and entirely uninterested in how clean you were. The world rewarded effort, not freshness. Because labour defined your identity, the evidence of that labour, dust, sweat, grime, became symbols of honesty and productivity. A farmhand with dirt on his face didn't look unkempt. He looked reliable. A woman returning from washing wool with soaked skirts and reddened hands wasn't judged. She was respected for maintaining her household economy. Even the smells that accompanied certain trades, tanneries, fishmongers, blacksmiths, were badges of authenticity. If you smelled like your job, you were doing it right. If you didn't, people wondered what, exactly, you were avoiding. Cleanliness, on the other hand, was suspicious. Very suspicious. A person who looked conspicuously clean was usually one of two things: wealthy enough to avoid manual labour, or idle enough to avoid doing anything useful. Either option raised eyebrows. Peasants didn't trust someone whose hands were too soft to have worked a field. Craftsmen didn't trust someone whose clothes lacked the telltale marks of a workshop. And everyone distrusted someone who smelled nice, for reasons ranging from moral caution to simple bewilderment. To medieval eyes, dirt was proof you were contributing to the survival of your household and community. Cleanliness, conversely, might suggest you'd spent the day lounging in luxury, scheming, being vain, or, worst of all, avoiding your responsibilities. If you were clean, the unspoken question was, why? Cleanliness required time. Time implied leisure, and leisure implied wealth or indifference to communal needs. Neither quality endeared you to your neighbours. Even professions considered clean by nature had their own forms of visible labour. Scribes, clerks, and monks often had ink-stained fingers. Cooks bore burns and smudges of flour. Shepherds carried the ever-present perfume of lanolin and sheep. No one escaped the aesthetic of work. If your body showed no indication of effort, people assumed you were living off the work of others. Lack of dirt looked less like hygiene and more like entitlement. Class divisions deepened this perception. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford to keep themselves cleaner, but even they didn't flaunt constant freshness. Too much attention to personal grooming could appear decadent or morally questionable. Nobles needed to project dignity, not luxury. A knight returning from battle wasn't expected to sparkle like a polished chalice. He was expected to look like he'd fought something. Dirt, in this sense, was also valour, a sign of courage and labour in service of duty. Meanwhile, peasants had no patience for people who pretended to be above dirt. A farmer who tried to remain spotless while others ploughed and sowed would be mocked long before he'd be admired. Communities relied on hard work from everyone, and visibly avoiding that work marked you as someone who consumed resources without helping produce them. Cleanliness, therefore, risks signalling you were not carrying your weight, or worse, that you thought yourself better than everyone else. Even in urban settings, where some people worked indoors or in trades less dependent on soil and sweat, the idea persisted. Butchers, bakers, candle makers, tailors, all of them had substances, materials, or byproducts that clung to their clothing and skin. Dirt wasn't uniform, it catered to your profession. A clean tailor was suspect. A clean butcher? Impossible. A clean tanner? A myth. Everyone bore the marks of their craft, and those marks told stories as clearly as any heraldic symbol. And it wasn't just physical dirt that mattered. Rough hands, sun-darkened skin, calluses, scars, they all functioned as proof of effort, reliability, and experience. A clean, soft hand suggested a lack of participation in the world's daily struggles. Such a hand might take up space in the community, but not contribute meaningfully to its survival. In a society where every pair of hands mattered, the condition of those hands spoke volumes. The cultural meaning of dirt also influenced social interactions. A muddy tunic didn't hinder you from entering the local tavern, it identified you. But try walking in looking freshly washed and scented, and you might find yourself sitting alone, everyone quietly shifting their stools away from the anomaly. Dirt connected people through shared struggle. Cleanliness separated you. So in the Middle Ages, filth wasn't just the result of labour. It was evidence of character. Dirt meant you were dependable. Dirt meant you were contributing. Dirt meant your place in the social world was secure. Because in medieval life, dirt was a resume, and showing up spotless was the equivalent of showing up with a blank page. To understand medieval attitudes toward cleanliness, you have to understand medieval smells, or rather, the medieval relationship with smells. People today recoil dramatically at the faintest hint of body odour, like startled Victorian butterflies. But medieval noses were forged in environments so aromatic so richly layered and so persistently pungent that they developed what can only be described as heroic endurance. Smell wasn't a warning sign, a social embarrassment, or a reason to buy deodorant. It was simply the background music of life. And when the entire world smells, well, nothing smells out of the ordinary. A medieval town didn't have distinct scent categories like we do today: clean, fresh, floral, or unscented. Instead, it had one unified scent profile best described as, yes, this is reality. Streets were busy, cramped, and alive with layers of aroma: damp wood, unwashed bodies, livestock, cooking fires, tanneries, market stalls, refuse piles, chamber pots emptied from windows, and the occasional dead animal someone absolutely meant to move yesterday. The human sense of smell simply adapted. It had to. Imagine trying to maintain modern perfume sensitivities in a world where a sudden wind could deliver the full personality of a pigsty to your doorstep. Because everyone lives so close to each other, and close to animals, waste, industry, and open drains, the medieval nose simply adjusted downward. Constant exposure dulled sensitivity. Someone walking into this world from the future might collapse, eyes watering, nose begging for retirement. But medieval people didn't notice most of it. They didn't expect pleasant smells, so they didn't search for them. You cannot be disappointed if your standards no longer exist. This normalization had social consequences. People didn't judge one another for smelling like sweat, smoke, or their occupation. Those scents weren't moral failings. They were facts of existence. A blacksmith who smelled faintly metallic, a fisherman who carried the essence of yesterday's catch, a baker who brought warm yeastiness wherever he went. These were considered normal, even comforting. Smells reflected the world functioning as it should. A person who didn't smell like anything familiar might actually raise suspicion. It meant you were working too little, interacting too little, or using substances people found deeply foreign. Body odor itself wasn't perceived through our modern lens. It wasn't a source of shame. It was simply a reality. Medieval people weren't oblivious to smells. They just weren't bothered by the ones we consider catastrophic. Sweat signaled effort. An effort signaled virtue. The idea of deodorizing yourself daily would have seemed absurd, like polishing your shoes before walking through a swamp. Why try to smell neutral when neutrality wasn't part of the scent vocabulary? Even the home was a sensory kaleidoscope. Houses smelled like smoke from hearth fires, damp rushes on the floor, woolen blankets absorbing life's various adventures, and whatever food had most recently been cooked. Add in animals kept indoors for warmth, and you have an aroma profile that would make modern interior designers faint. But to medieval families, this was the smell of domestic comfort. It meant warmth, safety, familiarity, nostalgia, even. Children likely grew up associating these scents with home and adulthood. Importantly, medieval people did appreciate pleasant smells. They just encountered them rarely and in different contexts. Flowers, herbs, and spices were luxuries. When someone carried the scent of rosemary or lavender, it was often a sign of festivity, ritual, or medicine. But these scents didn't serve as replacements for washing. They were accents added on top of the existing aroma palette. No one expected a single sprig of sage to erase the sensory history of a week's work. Odours also functioned differently because of medieval conceptions of health. Since disease was understood through air quality, not through germs, people focused on managing miasma, bad air that looked dangerous, such as fogs, swamp vapours, or smoky air thick enough to chew. Everyday human odours weren't interpreted as health threats. They were just air. The fear of smell as a contagion was specific and situational, not universal like it became centuries later. Another reason smells blended into the background was the sheer consistency of exposure. Medieval life had rhythms. Morning fires, midday cooking, market days, animal feeding, evening smoke, nighttime refuse disposal. These routines created predictable scent patterns. You didn't stop to analyse them any more than you stopped to analyse the sound of traffic today. When the sensory world is constant, it becomes invisible, and so personal scent, the idea of carrying your own signature smell, simply wasn't part of medieval identity. People weren't trying to smell good, bad, or neutral. They smelled like where they lived, what they did, and how they survived. That was the norm, and norms are comforting. It wasn't that medieval people lacked awareness. It was that their sensory expectations were calibrated to a reality far more aromatic than ours. Complaining about someone's smell would have been like complaining about the weather, pointless, universal, and usually met with a disinterested shrug. You could no more eliminate the smell of life than eliminate the sound of footsteps on a wooden floor. This sensory normalization explains much about their casual relationship with cleanliness. If you don't expect freshness, don't associate odour with shame, and don't believe scent indicates disease, then there's little motivation to alter the environment or the body. Smell wasn't a problem. It was the background noise of existence. Because in the Middle Ages, if everything smells bad, nothing smells bad, and the medieval nose was simply too busy surviving to be offended. If medieval people had created public service announcements, one of them would absolutely have been, "Think before you wash your hair." Not because they hated cleanliness, though they certainly weren't fans, but because the simple act of wetting your head was believed to open the door to every illness the world had ever invented. Washing your hair wasn't refreshing, rejuvenating, or luxurious. It was a gamble most people had no intention of taking. In the Middle Ages, a clean scalp wasn't a sign of hygiene. It was a sign you might be dead by Thursday. At the heart of the fear was temperature. Medieval people believed that keeping the body's natural heat securely inside was crucial for survival. The head being the command center of everything important. Thoughts, soul, personality, the ability to yell at your sheep, needed careful protection. Wet hair was the enemy. When your hair got wet, especially with cold water, the warmth of your skull could be sucked out like steam from a cooling kettle. And once that warmth escaped, illness entered. Not maybe, not possibly, but inevitably, like a cold breeze finding an open window. This wasn't superstition to them. It was logic. Wet hair created drafts. Drafts led to chills. Chills led to fevers. Fevers led to everything from headaches to death by moral lesson. Medieval medical texts warned people to guard their heads from sudden cold changes, especially after washing. The body was seen as vulnerable when transitioning between states. If you heated your head with warm water and then stepped into cool air, your body didn't interpret that as a refreshing contrast. It interpreted it as an assassination attempt, and the danger didn't stop there. Wet hair was also believed to weaken the neck and the brain. Medieval physicians described the head as a place where dangerous vapours could collect. Water, by opening pores and loosening the body's defences, made these vapours even more likely to sink in. A washed head, they argued, attracted unhealthy air the way honey attracts flies. And in a world with no concept of airborne pathogens, unhealthy air was the catch-all villain behind every unexplained illness. Because the head was so vulnerable, medieval wisdom insisted that washing hair during certain seasons, especially winter, was practically suicidal. Cold weather was already seen as an aggressive adversary. Combining it with wet hair was tempting fate. Imagine villagers watching someone wash their hair in January. They wouldn't admire the effort. They'd whisper prayers for the soul of the recently doomed. Even in summer, the advice wasn't much kinder. The heat could open pores too widely, leaving the head susceptible to bad humours drifting in. No matter the season, the universe always had a reason to punish you for trying to look decent. Practical realities reinforced these beliefs. Hair took a long time to dry without modern tools. If you washed your hair in the morning, it might still be damp at dinner, especially in drafty homes where the concept of insulation was more aspiration than reality. And while you waited for it to dry, the wind, the cold, or even the wrong kind of evening breeze could slip into your damp scalp and take up residence. A simple head wash could turn into days of discomfort or headaches. Outcomes people then linked directly to the bath, not to the environment or hygiene practices. And let's not forget the sheer inconvenience of washing hair. Medieval hair was long more often than not, and frequently braided, pinned, or bound up. Untangling and rewashing it was a mammoth task. Shampoo didn't exist. Instead, people might use rye flour, lye solutions, vinegar, or herbal rinses, all of which came with their own risks. Lye could burn your scalp. Vinegar wasn't ideal on cold days, and flour, while useful, attracted insects if not rinsed properly. Clean hair was a project, and a dangerous one at that. There was also a symbolic dimension. Hair wasn't merely cosmetic, it held social, religious, and cultural meaning. For many, hair represented strength, status, or virtue. Women's hair in particular was considered potent and spiritually charged. To expose it to risk by washing too casually felt irresponsible. The idea that a casual rinse might jeopardize a woman's health, fertility, or modesty created additional pressure to avoid unnecessary washing. Because washing hair was so rare, people developed alternative strategies. Combing, brushing, braiding, perfuming, and using powders became common methods to manage texture and odor without water. A well-maintained braid could stay neat for days, even weeks, and served as a protective style that eliminated the need for frequent washing. Medieval people weren't unconcerned with appearance. They simply deployed methods that didn't threaten their survival. And so, in this world where head warmth equaled life and drafts equaled doom, washing hair was viewed as an unreasonable risk. People avoided it not because they didn't value hygiene, but because they valued staying alive. When you believe wet hair can usher in a fever, paralysis, or worse, the choice becomes obvious. Better to live with a slightly greasy braid than die with a clean one. In medieval logic, a clean scalp was a brief, beautiful, and deeply foolish act, because it was always one chill away from disaster. In medieval society, public bathhouses were supposed to offer warmth, cleanliness, and relaxation, but they often delivered the exact opposite. If the medieval world had printed warning labels, bathhouses would have needed one the size of a cathedral wall. Caution may contain everything you don't want to catch. Because for all their social charm and steamy ambience, public baths were also biological buffets where illnesses mingled freely, waiting for their next victim. To medieval people, visiting a bath didn't protect you from disease. It exposed you to an entire community's germs, habits, and questionable decisions. To understand why, imagine stepping inside a medieval bathhouse. Rooms were heated with roaring fires, steam drifted through the air, and large wooden tubs or stone pools invited strangers to soak together in communal water. The water was rarely changed between guests. Why would it be? Heating it took time, fuel, and labour, and fuel wasn't grown in trees. Well, technically it was. But you still didn't waste it lightly. As a result, dozens of people, sometimes hundreds, bathed in the same water until it achieved what polite historians call a noticeable density. This wasn't a warm bath, it was a medieval soup. Now add the tools, strigils, brushes, pumice stones, scraping implements, cloths. Many of these were shared among bathers or cleaned in the same water everyone else sat in. If someone had a rash, infection, cut, or parasite, these implements acted like helpful little couriers, spreading microscopic chaos from person to person long before anyone had the language to describe what was happening. Modern science would call this cross-contamination. Medieval bathhouse owners called it Tuesday. Then there was the issue of skin exposure. Bathing softened and warmed the skin, opening pores and making people more vulnerable to environmental hazards, at least according to medieval medical theory. Even without germ knowledge, people noticed patterns. Someone would visit a bathhouse feeling fine, then fall ill within days. Because the water held debris, hair, oils, sweat, and whatever someone coughed into it, people made an obvious, if not scientifically accurate, connection. The bath made them sick, And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Communal water, especially warm, stagnant water, creates a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and pathogens. Without chlorination or filtration, bathhouse pools could become incubators for disease. Some bathhouses attempted to improve sanitation by draining and refilling the water periodically, but periodically varied widely depending on location, wealth, and the owner's moral commitment to hygiene. In many places, the water was changed on a schedule closer to when someone complains loudly enough. Disease transmission didn't stop at the pool. Bathhouses were intimate places. People sat close, shared food, shared conversation, shared drinks, and, in many notorious establishments, shared company they probably shouldn't have shared. Where people gathered, diseases gathered with them. Respiratory illnesses, skin infections, lice, fleas, and sexually transmitted diseases found bathhouses extremely convenient. During outbreaks, especially those involving plague, bathhouses became objects of suspicion and fear. If people were dying rapidly, and if many of those people happened to have visited the bathhouse shortly before falling ill, it didn't require germ theory to draw the conclusion that the bathhouse was cursed, contaminated, or otherwise flirting with death itself. Municipal authorities sometimes closed bathhouses during epidemics. Clergy condemned them for being dens of corruption. Ordinary people simply stayed away. Better dirty and alive than clean and coughing. Even minor illnesses contributed to the bathhouse's bad reputation. Medieval people noticed that colds, fevers, and stomach issues circulated more readily among frequent bathers. They didn't understand viruses or bacteria, but they knew proximity played a role. Warm, damp rooms with poor ventilation encouraged airborne ailments. If someone sneezed, the steam carried it with theatrical flourish to every corner of the bathhouse. A single cough could become a community project. There were also physical hazards. When floors were wet and surfaces slippery, injuries were common. A fall could result in a broken limb or cracked skull. Serious injuries in a time when medical knowledge was limited, and pain relief often amounted to biting leather and praying quietly. The bathhouse didn't just host disease, it hosted danger of every variety. Even after the bath, the risks continued. People left with damp skin and hair, stepping into cold air that medieval medical beliefs insisted would cause illness. Because baths relaxed the body, people were thought to be more vulnerable post-soak. Some described feeling lightheaded or weak after bathing, likely due to the heat or dehydration, which reinforced the perception that baths themselves induce sickness. As awareness of these dangers spread, public confidence eroded. People began to associate bathhouses less with cleanliness and more with contagion. Bathing, once a social pleasure, transformed into a risky proposition. Some avoided bathhouses completely, opting instead for dry methods of personal maintenance. Others limited their visits to special occasions. Many embraced the belief that water, not dirt, posed the real threat to their health, and so the bathhouse, intended as a place of rejuvenation, earned a reputation that medieval people could not shake. It was a crossroads where every ailment in the region gathered for a casual swim. Cleanliness wasn't guaranteed. Disease was. In medieval thinking, the bath didn't purify you. The bath didn't refresh you. The bath didn't protect you. The bath introduced you to sickness, and your best chance of survival was simply not showing up. If there is one creature that truly ruled medieval daily life, not kings, not priests, not landlords, it was the flea. Fleas didn't pay rent, didn't acknowledge authority, and didn't care whether you lived in a thatched hut or a stone manor. They were equal opportunity nuisances, tiny acrobats of misery who leapt through society with boundless enthusiasm and absolutely no respect for personal space. In a world without effective pest control, fleas weren't a problem you solved. They were a fact you accepted, and medieval people didn't waste energy fighting battles they had no hope of winning. Fleas were everywhere. Homes, beds, clothing, straw mattresses, wooden floors, stables, barns, workshops, market stalls. If it had warmth, shade, or a heartbeat, fleas set up shop in it. Even the cleanest rooms and the wealthiest estates hosted them. Castles weren't immune. If anything, their tapestries, woolen fabrics, and feather-stuffed cushions were five-star resorts for parasites. You could bathe yourself, burn your bedding, scrub your floors, shake out your clothes, and say a heartfelt prayer, and still wake up with a new constellation of itchy red dots on your skin. The medieval world didn't lack awareness of fleas. People noticed them constantly. They mentioned them in letters, sermons, jokes, poems, and even medical texts. Yet awareness meant nothing when the available solutions ranged from mildly inconvenient to completely useless. Herbal sachets, scented oils, ashes, vinegar, or strong-smelling plants might repel fleas temporarily, but fleas were committed professionals. They returned the moment the scent faded, or sooner if they felt confident. Washing clothes didn't eliminate fleas either. First, clothes weren't washed frequently. Second, even when garments were scrubbed, fleas could simply hide in seams, folds, or the ever-present straw bedding. Third, once the clothes were clean, people put them back on in the same flea-friendly environment. It was the medieval equivalent of mopping the floor while the ceiling still leaks. People tried fumigation, burning sulfur or aromatic herbs indoors. This was occasionally effective in smoking fleas out, but also effective in smoking out the humans. Even if you successfully chased fleas away today, they'd return tomorrow with fresh enthusiasm, and maybe a few friends who'd heard about the warm accommodations. And the real issue wasn't just adult fleas, it was the eggs. Flea eggs slipped into floorboards, carpets, straw mattresses, and cracks in the walls. They waited, hatched, and re-established colonies like tiny, determined landlords who never forgot a tenancy agreement. Medieval living conditions, organic materials, close quarters, livestock nearby, and inconsistent cleaning routines created perfect breeding grounds. Trying to eliminate fleas was like trying to drain the ocean with a wooden spoon. Because fleas were everywhere, people adapted psychologically. They stopped expecting to live without pests. You weren't judged for having fleas. You were judged for reacting to them as if they were extraordinary. Scratching was normal. Complaining too much made you seem delicate. A flea bite wasn't a crisis. It was part of existence, as unremarkable as a gust of wind or a creaking floorboard. People joked about fleas, cursed them, and accepted them in equal measure. Even the wealthy, who could afford better materials and more cleaning labour, didn't escape infestation. Silk and fine linen didn't stop fleas from visiting. Soft bedding made ideal hiding spots. Servants, animals, and guests moved freely in and out of buildings, carrying fleas like invisible travel companions. Some nobles imported exotic perfumes or hung sweet-smelling herbs to improve their living spaces, but scents didn't kill fleas. They only gave the room a pleasant aroma while the fleas enjoyed their stay. Medieval medical understanding didn't help either. People didn't know fleas transmitted disease. They only knew they caused itching. The connection between parasites and illness wouldn't be discovered for centuries. Without seeing fleas as dangerous, there was little urgency to eradicate them, even if they'd had the means. Fleas were annoying, not deadly, at least so it seemed. Scratching a bite was frustrating, but it didn't signal an emergency. Just another Tuesday. The resignation went deeper. Fleas lived on livestock, and livestock lived everywhere. Animals slept indoors, shared living quarters, and mingled in close proximity with humans. Every cow, goat, dog, cat, pig, chicken, and rat worked as unpaid flea transportation services. As long as animals were part of the household economy, and they absolutely were, fleas would remain permanent residents. People developed coping mechanisms rather than prevention. Bedding might be beaten outdoors to dislodge pests. Clothing might be brushed vigorously. People combed their hair with purpose-built knit combs, resigned but not defeated. A few creative souls even placed herbs inside bedding or under straw mattresses for good luck, although the fleas demonstrated no notable superstition. No one expected a flea-free life. It wasn't an attainable dream. You couldn't avoid fleas any more than you could avoid weather, mud, or taxes. People simply lived with them, scratched them, swore at them, and went on with their day. This worldview shaped attitudes about cleanliness. Why spend energy trying to stay spotless when the environment itself guaranteed you'd be reinfected by nightfall? Why wage war on creatures guaranteed to win? Medieval people weren't apathetic. They were practical. Fleas were inevitable. Dirt was inevitable. Effort was better spent on survival than on chasing an impossible fantasy of pest-free living. And so the unspoken bargain of medieval existence became clear. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. If medieval people had a motto for personal hygiene, it would have been something like, "Why wash it when you can hide it?" In a world where water was mistrusted, baths were suspicious, soap was unreliable, and fleas were committed squatters, true cleanliness was often unrealistic. But smelling better, that was achievable. Medieval scent culture wasn't about deodorizing the body, it was about camouflaging it, a fragrant illusion meant to coexist peacefully with the odors beneath. You didn't erase the smell, you negotiated terms. Herbs, oils, flowers, and aromatic woods became the medieval answer to a problem water couldn't solve. People didn't expect to smell clean, they expected to smell different, ideally in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. If you carried the scent of lavender or rosemary, it didn't mean you were freshly washed. It meant you had made an attempt, a symbolic gesture toward refinement, like putting a bow on a slightly disgruntled donkey. Let's start with herbs, the backbone of medieval scent strategy. Perfumed sachets were tucked into clothing, sewn into hems, hidden in pockets, or hung around the neck. Rosemary, lavender, thyme, mint, and sage were favourites. Not because they purified anything, but because they were strong enough to compete with the existing environment. These weren't delicate scents meant to evoke a peaceful meadow. These were bold, assertive fragrances that marched into battle against sweat, smoke, and livestock. A medieval herbal sachet didn't whisper freshness. It shouted, "I tried." Then there were pomanders, the most charmingly medieval solution of all. A pomander was a small, often ornate ball filled with aromatic materials, ambergris, cloves, cinnamon, dried flowers, resin, musk, or whatever potent-smelling ingredients a person could access. Carried in the hand, tied to a belt, or hung from the neck, pomanders served two crucial purposes, covering personal odour and protecting against bad air, miasma. People believed sweet scents had protective properties. If foul smells caused disease, then pleasant smells fought it. The pomander was your portable health shield, part fashion accessory, part medieval air freshener, part wishful thinking. Perfumed oils were another solution. Rather than washing the skin, people applied scented oils to mask odours and soften rough texture. This method had practical benefits. Oils countered the dryness caused by cold weather and woolen clothing. But they also had a strategic advantage. They smelled reassuringly intentional. A lightly perfumed wrist or neck signalled that you cared about presentation, even if your actual cleanliness levels remained somewhere between questionable and archaeologically interesting. Even hair, rarely washed for fear of illness, received aromatic treatments. People brushed herbal powders into their hair to refresh it. Sometimes the powders absorbed excess oil. More often, they simply added a new scent layer to the existing situation. Rose petals, violets, chamomile, or crushed dried flowers might be woven into braids. Hair scents weren't meant to clean. They were meant to distract. If someone caught a pleasant whiff of rosemary when you turned your head, they wouldn't think about what else might be living in your braids. Clothing, too, became a vehicle for scent. Garments were stored with fragrant herbs or hung near smoke infused with pleasant woods like juniper. Smoke-scented clothing might strike modern noses as strange, but in the medieval context, smelling like a well-managed hearth was an upgrade. It meant warmth, stability, and domestic competence. Not to mention it masked other less flattering odours. Perfuming the home was equally important because the home itself contributed aggressively to a person's overall scent profile. Burnt herbs, aromatic branches, or crushed plants scattered across floors helped maintain olfactory dignity. Rushes on the floor, changed occasionally when they became too saturated with life's various adventures, could be mixed with flowers or sweet-smelling grasses. Again, these didn't clean anything. They distracted from everything. This strategy of masking rather than cleansing made perfect sense in the medieval context. Cleanliness was rare, water was risky, and dirt was normal. Smell management became a form of social communication. A pleasant scent suggested effort, status, refinement, or religious devotion. Monasteries burned herbal incense for spiritual reasons. Nobles favoured exotic spices or resins imported at great expense. Even the poorest households gathered whatever fragrant materials they could find to maintain an impression of care, even if full bathing remained impractical. And medieval people weren't naive about the limits. They knew a sachet couldn't conquer a week of hard labour. They knew a pomander couldn't silence the barnyard aroma drifting from their boots. They understood that scent layering wasn't the same as cleaning, but they did it anyway because in a world of unavoidable smells, masking was the only realistic option. Their goal wasn't perfection, it was manageability. They weren't striving to smell good, only to smell less like battlefields and sheep. Medieval scent culture reveals a pragmatic approach to hygiene. Smells couldn't be prevented, but they could be managed. Odours couldn't be eliminated, but they could be counterbalanced. Cleanliness couldn't be achieved easily, but presentation still mattered. And so, rather than chasing an impossible ideal, medieval people embraced aromatic diplomacy. You didn't remove the smell, you negotiated with it. If you went to a medieval doctor and asked whether you should bathe more often, he wouldn't just say no, he'd say it with the confidence of someone convinced he was saving your life. To modern ears, this sounds absurd. But in the Middle Ages, medical authority didn't simply suggest avoiding bathing, it insisted on it. Physicians viewed dirt not as neglect, but as protection. Cleanliness didn't strengthen the body, it exposed it. And so, in a reversal of everything we expect from healthcare, your doctor's advice was simple. Don't wash. Stay dirty. It's safer. This attitude wasn't rooted in ignorance. It was rooted in humoral theory, the trusted medical system of the era. According to this worldview, the body was held together by the delicate balance of four fluids and the precious heat that kept them behaving or misbehaving in predictable ways. Anything that altered the skin's condition, the body's temperature, or the flow of natural vapours was considered risky. Bathing, especially in warm water, did all three at once. Hot baths were believed to weaken the body's natural heat, which physicians saw as the core engine of health. Warm water relaxed muscles, softened the skin, and, most dangerously, opened the pores. Once the pores opened, they provided an easy entry point for bad air, the invisible threat medieval doctors feared most. Disease, they believed, drifted through the atmosphere like a villain looking for unlocked doors, and bathing tragically unlocked them all. Cold baths didn't fare any better. If hot water dispersed essential heat, cold water assaulted it. Doctors warned that cold bathing shocked the body, constricted vessels, halted the natural movement of humours, and risked internal stiffness. You could emerge from a cold bath looking refreshed, but according to medical texts, what you really emerged with was a higher chance of paralysis, respiratory trouble, or a slow, dramatic decline attributed to weakened spirits. Perhaps the most serious accusation medieval doctors levelled against bathing was that it destabilised the humours. Stability was the cornerstone of health, routine, moderation, predictable patterns. Bathing, by contrast, was a dramatic event. A sudden surge of heat, a rush of moisture, a shift in circulation. Physicians saw this as bodily chaos. If your humours were simmering in proper harmony, why disrupt them with a tub of hot water? It was equivalent to shaking a fragile snow globe and hoping the flakes landed attractively. Doctors also discouraged bathing because they believed it overstimulated the skin, drawing blood and humours outward, leaving internal organs unprotected. Medieval texts caution that excessive bathing could cause dizziness, faintness, nosebleeds, or even delirium, symptoms we might now attribute to dehydration, temperature changes, or poor ventilation, but which medieval physicians interpreted as direct consequences of meddling with nature. And then there was the issue of post-bath vulnerability. Physicians repeatedly warned that after a bath the body entered a delicate, temporarily weakened state. Porous, warm, relaxed, and open to influence, it was no longer a fortress, but a wide-open gate. Stepping into cool air after bathing was considered a reckless gamble. The same breeze that would refresh a modern person might, according to medieval doctors, doom a freshly bathed patient to fever, chills, or sudden death. A bath wasn't an isolated event. It was the start of a dangerous chain reaction that only the truly lucky escaped unscathed. Medieval physicians weren't entirely opposed to bathing. They just believed it should be used with extreme caution as a targeted medical procedure. Baths were prescribed like powerful medication, rarely, carefully, and only under professional supervision. They might instruct a patient to bathe in lukewarm water infused with specific herbs at a particular time of day, after eating the right meal, and followed by strict rest. Bathing was part of therapy, not daily life, and much like a modern controlled drug, misuse could have consequences. Healthy people, on the other hand, were strongly advised not to bathe unless absolutely necessary. Why tempt fate by exposing a well-functioning body to the dangers of heat imbalance, pore expansion, or vapor infiltration? Better to keep yourself intact, sealed, and safe. Dirt wasn't harmful, it was neutral. Bathing wasn't beneficial, it was disruptive. The safest medical advice: leave well enough alone. Physicians also linked bathing to moral weakness. A person who craved frequent baths was seen as overly indulgent, vulnerable to excess, and dangerously concerned with comfort. In a culture that prized resilience and moderation, too much bathing smelled suspiciously like vanity, luxury, or, worse, foreign influence. Doctors often warned that bathing wasn't just physically weakening, it was spiritually softening. One who sought pleasure in warm water might easily be tempted by other, less forgivable pleasures. The power of medical authority amplified these warnings. Physicians trained in universities spoke with confidence and wrote respected manuals. Their convictions shaped public behavior. When a doctor told you bathing caused illness, you believed him. His authority overshadowed instinct, and so dirt, which posed no immediate threat, became a preferred condition. It is ironic, from a modern viewpoint, that those trained to protect health encouraged habits that preserved filth. But in the medieval intellectual framework, they acted rationally. They based their advice on observation, theory, and the tools available to them. Their goal wasn't hygiene, it was survival, and in their eyes, nothing endangered survival faster than an unnecessary bath. Because to a medieval physician, the clean body wasn't the healthy one, the protected body was the healthy one, and protection meant one thing: your physician recommended dirt for safety. To modern minds, germs are everywhere, microscopic villains lurking on doorknobs, keyboards, handrails, and even your phone, especially your phone. We wash, sanitize, scrub, and disinfect because we know that danger hides where eyes cannot see. But in the Middle Ages, invisible danger wasn't dangerous at all, because people simply didn't believe it existed. If disease had no visible agent, then clearly something else must be responsible. And so medieval people built an entire worldview of health without germs, a worldview that unintentionally defended dirt, tolerated filth, and regarded cleanliness as optional at best and hazardous at worst. Without germ theory, medieval people understood illness through what they could observe: odour, environment, weather, mood, behaviour, personal sin, divine will, and visible corruption in air or water. Disease to them wasn't a microscopic ambush. It was a social, spiritual, or atmospheric event. If a fever swept through town, it wasn't because someone failed to wash their hands. It was because the air turned foul, the stars aligned wrongly, or God was sending a particularly stern memo. Because germs weren't part of the equation, people had no reason to believe dirt posed any threat. Dirt was simply dirt, a nuisance, a stain on clothing, a sign of your occupation, even a protective layer. It didn't crawl into your bloodstream or unleash infections. It didn't carry biological dangers. If anything, dirt was seen as grounding, earthly, and occasionally medicinal. The idea that particles too small to see could kill you would have sounded like an elaborate joke, or magic. And medieval people were skeptical of magic unless the church approved it. Disease explanations instead relied on concepts like miasma, the belief that bad or corrupted air caused illness. This meant the danger came not from dirty bodies or objects, but from environments that looked or smelled unhealthy. Swamps, rotting material, polluted air, or dense fog were considered the true culprits. And because bad air was visible or at least detectable by smell, people focused their preventive efforts on avoiding certain places, not on cleaning themselves. If someone caught an illness after trekking through a foul-smelling market or passing by a butcher's refuse pile, the conclusion wasn't I should wash, it was I should avoid that street. Cleanliness didn't enter the conversation because it didn't logically connect to the perceived cause of sickness. You didn't sanitize yourself to fight disease. You carried sweet herbs, covered your nose, prayed, or avoided suspicious breezes. Even within households, the absence of germ theory meant people weren't concerned about spreading sickness through shared contact. If your child was coughing, you didn't isolate them or wash your hands after tending to them. Illness wasn't understood as contagious in the modern sense. It spread through corrupted air or divine will. Families cared for the sick closely, breathing the same air, touching the same bedding, using the same utensils, because what mattered was fate, morality, and environment, not hygiene. Doctors reinforced this worldview. Medical texts emphasize balancing the humours, observing astrological conditions, moderating diet, and avoiding dangerous environments. Not one medical authority wrote, "Wash your hands." Why would they? They couldn't see a reason. Disease had no microscopic villain, no hidden messenger, no invisible invader. It was a matter of imbalance, environment, or spirituality, all of which required philosophical solutions, not cleanliness. Even bloodletting, one of the most common medical treatments, was done without regard for sanitation. Tools were reused, hands were unwashed, and bandages were reused or exposed to open air. None of this struck medieval practitioners as dangerous. The only criteria that mattered were the timing, the moon phase, and the patient's temperament. Without germs, there was no justification for cleanliness beyond aesthetics. This absence of microbial understanding had one obvious consequence. Cleanliness had no medical value. Bathing did not prevent illness. Washing clothes did not prevent illness. Cleaning surfaces did not prevent illness. So why bother? Why endure cold water, hot water, questionable soap, or dangerous post-bath chills if none of it guarded against the horrors people feared? Plague, fever, dysentery, or putrid humours. Even when people noticed patterns that hinted at contagion, like a household falling ill one by one, they interpreted it differently. They believed corrupted air lingered in rooms, not that disease transferred between people, so they opened windows, burnt herbs, or moved beds. But they did not wash. Invisible dangers simply weren't part of their mental toolkit. Medieval life was brutal, but it was lived in the visible world. If something harmed you, it had form, a weapon, a storm, a beast, a tainted smell, a sinful action, or divine wrath. The concept of entities so small they could invade your body and kill you. That required a scientific revolution still centuries away. As a result, Medieval people viewed cleanliness through practical eyes, not scientific ones. Cleanliness might provide comfort, beauty, or social approval, but it did not provide safety. In fact, as many chapters of this story have shown, cleanliness was often viewed as risky, destabilizing, or wasteful. Why risk weakening the body with a bath if baths didn't prevent disease? Why wash clothes if the smells would return within hours and the sickness came from the sky, not the skin? Medieval people responded perfectly logically to the information they had. Without germs, there was no justification for hygiene as we understand it. The world was shaped by what could be seen, smelled, touched, or morally interpreted. And because the invisible didn't exist, neither did the invisible threat. In a world without microorganisms, one rule shaped hygiene choices. If you can't see the danger, it doesn't exist. If you've ever stepped out of a warm shower into a cold bathroom and felt your soul briefly leave your body, congratulations, you already understand medieval winter bathing. Except imagine that bathroom is actually a drafty timber house with gaps in the walls, a dirt floor colder than most breakups, a fire that refuses to stay lit, and water that begins freezing while you're still looking at it. In the Middle Ages, winter wasn't a season. It was an antagonist, and bathing in winter wasn't refreshing. It was a personal attack from nature. The first problem was simple. Cold water is misery. Heating water required fuel, expensive, labor-intensive fuel. Wood had to be chopped, dried, stored, and burned sparingly. Every log burned for a bath was a log not used for cooking, heating the home, or keeping your family alive through long nights. A warm bath demanded resources normally reserved for survival, not luxury. Most households didn't have the fuel or the nerve to waste precious firewood on something that produced no heat benefit afterward. So people bathed in cold water. And cold medieval water wasn't like the pleasantly chilly kind that splashes from a modern tap. Medieval water came from wells, rivers, and rain barrels, sources that absorbed winter like a curse. Washing your face in such water was an act of bravery. Submerging your entire body in it. That was performance art in the genre of I regret everything. Then there was the problem of indoor temperatures, better described as outdoor temperatures, but with walls. Medieval homes were drafty, leaky, and poorly insulated. Wind crept through cracks. Frost formed inside windows. The air indoors could be as cold as the air outside, only slightly softened by the fireplace in a single room, which, by the way, did not heat the entire house, unless your house was the size of a large wardrobe. Undressing to bathe in winter meant voluntarily exposing yourself to temperatures that made water and air dangerous. Before the bath, you froze. During the bath, you froze. After the bath, you froze harder. If medieval bathers had invented a slogan, it would have been, "At least when I'm dirty, I'm warm." And the danger was real. Cold exposure wasn't merely unpleasant, it was life-threatening. Hypothermia was not a word medieval people used, but it was certainly a condition they experienced. Wet skin loses heat rapidly. In icy weather, a damp body became a perfect conduit for chill, leading to shivering fits, weakened limbs, respiratory problems, or sudden collapse. The idea that bathing could make you sick wasn't just humoral theory, it was practical observation. People did bathe in winter, and did become dangerously cold afterward. It wasn't germs they feared, it was freezing to death before they made it back to their clothes. Preparing a bath in winter also compromised the entire household. Opening barrels, hauling buckets, and heating water all required moving about in the bitter cold. And once all that water was brought inside, it created more cold. Spilled water soaked into floors, turned to icy patches, or chilled the air as it evaporated. Families often avoided winter bathing not out of laziness, but because the process threatened to make their homes even colder than they already were. Outside the home, the situation wasn't better. Public bathhouses were often closed in winter or operated under much harsher conditions. Even heated ones struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures as outside air seeped through walls and wooden structures. The moment you stepped out of the tub, the steam clinging to your skin became a refrigerated curse. The walk home afterward, with damp hair and chilled limbs, was practically a death march. Many people simply refused to risk it. Dirt was safer. Winter hygiene had to be creative. People relied on partial washing. Hands, faces, maybe necks if they were feeling ambitious. They used cloth wiping, dry scrubbing, or warmed herbal mixtures instead of full immersion. These methods were less about cleanliness and more about self-preservation. Staying alive mattered more than staying clean. Looking respectable mattered, but not enough to justify freezing off a limb. Clothing also complicated winter bathing. Most medieval garments were made of heavy wool, many layers deep. Removing them in cold weather wasn't a casual process. It was a tactical operation. Getting undressed meant losing every protective layer. Getting dressed again meant forcing your body, trembling violently, back into multiple stiff layers that resisted movement. Even nobles struggled with this. Servants helping them bathe suffered right alongside them, hands stiff with cold, breath fogging the air as they prepared hot water that cooled far too quickly. And once washed, the drying process was another icy ordeal. Towels existed but were limited and often coarse. Hair, especially long medieval hair, remained wet for hours. In winter, that wasn't an inconvenience, it was a medical risk. People wrapped their heads in cloths or fur caps to protect warmth, but even that wasn't foolproof. Many believed correctly that going to sleep with damp hair could be dangerous. It's no wonder medieval people often delayed bathing until warmer months. Spring and summer were bathing seasons. Winter was survival season. Cleanliness could wait until the weather stopped actively trying to murder you. So when medieval individuals chose not to bathe in January, it wasn't because they lacked discipline or hygiene values. It was because winter bathing was an extreme sport requiring bravery, abundant firewood, tolerant nerves, and a body temperature that could afford to take a beating. To the medieval mind, dirt was tolerable. Frostbite and chills were not. And so winter baths weren't avoided because people were dirty by choice. They were avoided because bathing in winter was a personal attack from nature itself. If medieval people seemed hesitant to wash, one enormous reason sits right at the centre of daily life. Their water sources were deeply untrustworthy. When your options for bathing include a river that doubles as a sewer, a well that tastes faintly of livestock, and a stream whose colour suggests it's in the middle of a personal crisis, personal hygiene becomes less of a priority and more of a strategic calculation. Medieval water wasn't refreshing. It was suspicious. Every cup, bucket and handful carried a question mark shaped like someone else's waste. To modern minds, clean water arrives from taps as clear as a moral lesson. But medieval water came from nature, and nature had absolutely no commitment to sanitation. Rivers, streams and wells were exposed to everything: rain runoff, dead animals, industrial waste, human waste, animal waste, and whatever creative horrors floated downstream from the next village. Many waterways were shared spaces. People washed clothes in them, rinsed tools in them, slaughtered animals beside them, and occasionally tossed unwanted carcasses directly into them. By the time the water reached you, it had already lived a full and dramatic life. Wells, the backbone of medieval towns, weren't much better. A well was only as clean as the land around it, and medieval urban planning was not known for its commitment to modern principles like distance from waste. Privies, cesspits, and household refuse heaps often sat dangerously close to wells. Heavy rains or structural cracks allowed contamination to seep into the very water source meant to sustain life. People didn't need microscopes to know something strange was going on below ground. Water might taste off, smell odd, or carry visible specks of its recent adventures. Rivers carried their own challenges. In bustling towns, a river served as the medieval equivalent of a multi-purpose utility channel: water supply, laundry basin, garbage disposal, industrial drain. livestock watering hole, and convenient location for dumping whatever you didn't want to deal with anymore. Tanneries, dye works, butchers, and fullers all relied on rivers, and their waste products joined the current enthusiastically. If a medieval person walked to the river intending to wash themselves, they weren't just encountering water, they were confronting the entire economic output of the town. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery, cholera-like outbreaks, and other digestive nightmares were common, even if people didn't understand the microbial cause. What they did understand was pattern. Person drinks from the weird-smelling stream. Person becomes violently ill. They might blame the water's temperature, colour, or proximity to certain plants, but either way, water became suspicious. And once something earns a reputation for making people violently sick, splashing it across your entire body becomes a less attractive option. Some communities developed workarounds. They designated upstream sections of rivers for drinking and downstream sections for waste. They protected certain wells with stone coverings. They drained water through cloth or mixed it with alcohol to make it safer. But these solutions were inconsistent, and they did nothing to change the fact that water simply could not be trusted on site. You couldn't tell by looking whether a bucket held clean water or a gastrointestinal adventure. And while drinking water carried one set of dangers, bathing water carried another. Every time someone washed themselves, rinsed linens, or dipped their feet into a river, they contributed their own layer of contamination. A communal washing site could see dozens of people pass through in a day. The result was a liquid archive of everyone's recent activities, generously shared with whoever washed next. Even rural areas weren't immune. Animals wandered freely, leaving traces of their presence in ponds, brooks, and wells. A peaceful-looking meadow stream might hide runoff from a nearby pasture, and if medieval people hesitated to bathe in winter because of the cold, they hesitated in summer because stagnant water became the kingdom of algae, insects, and mysterious floaters no one wanted to identify. Because water sources were inconsistent and often compromised, many medieval people understandably preferred not to immerse their bodies in them at all. Dirt, after all, was predictable. Water was not. Dirt didn't betray you with sudden illness. Water, on the other hand, had a tendency to punish optimism. Interestingly, people were often more cautious about washing than drinking. Drinking water was necessary, bathing was not. So even when water seemed risky, drinking it, sometimes mixed with ale or wine, remained a daily requirement. Bathing, on the other hand, represented an elective risk, an optional encounter with a fluid that might currently be harbouring the entire biography of the town's waste system. For wealthier households, there was at least the possibility of fetching cleaner water from distant springs, or having servants boil water for bathing. But even then, suspicion persisted. Water that started clean could become contaminated in storage barrels, wooden tubs, or buckets that hadn't been properly rinsed since the last century. Even nobles encountered odd flavours and unexplained illnesses. So when medieval people avoided washing, it wasn't absurdity, it was practicality. Why immerse yourself in something that smelled questionable, looked murky, tasted metallic, and might carry whatever your neighbour dumped in it yesterday? Why risk inviting sickness into your pores simply because you wanted pleasantly scented armpits? Medieval people lived close to their environment, and that environment had rules. The rule of water was simple. Trust it with caution. Drink it reluctantly. Bathe in it only if you dare. Because in the Middle Ages, water didn't represent purity. Water represented history, and not necessarily the kind you wanted on your skin. After all, that water had already lived a full life before it ever reached you. In the medieval world, dirt wasn't just the absence of cleanliness. It was a presence, a layer, a shield. To modern minds, dirt is the enemy, something to scrub away with foamy determination. But to medieval people, dirt was a familiar companion, loyal and dependable, like a slightly smelly friend who nevertheless always has your back. Grime didn't merely cling to the body, it protected it. In a society without germ theory, reliable heating, or stable medical knowledge, many believed that dirt acted as insulation, sealing the body from dangerous forces. Filth wasn't neglect, it was armour. The reasoning wasn't as wild as it sounds. Medieval medicine insisted the human body was highly sensitive to external influences: cold drafts, harsh winds, shifting temperatures, bad air, and cosmic whims. The skin, far from being a sealed barrier, was believed to be porous and vulnerable, a collection of tiny openings through which all manner of harmful vapours could enter. A clean, freshly washed body was exposed. A dirty body, covered in a fine patina of earth, sweat, and oil, was protected. Dirt filled in the pores, dirt insulated warmth, dirt kept out intrusive influences. The logic became especially powerful in regions with harsh climates. Cold was considered one of the greatest threats to human health. Medieval physicians warned constantly about the body losing its natural heat, the vital internal fire that fueled life itself. Dirt, they observed, trapped warmth. A thin coating of grime could function like primitive insulation. Clean skin, on the other hand, lost heat rapidly. People didn't need to study thermodynamics to notice this. They simply felt it. Washing made them cold. Staying dirty kept them warm, and warmth equaled safety. This belief extended across all levels of medieval society. Peasants working the fields viewed dirt as part of the natural world that nourished them. To be covered in earth was to be in harmony with the land. Clean hands, by contrast, signalled someone who did not labour, someone out of touch with the soil and its protective embrace. For labourers, being caked in mud or dust wasn't simply an unavoidable consequence of work. It was a condition that kept the body hardy and resistant. Among the upper classes, the idea manifested differently but still persisted. Nobles often bathed more than peasants, but were still warned by physicians not to overdo it. Excessive washing weakened the body, stripped essential oils from the skin, and left the person exposed. Even the nobility was told that some natural residue should remain to preserve one's warmth and vitality. A perfectly clean noble, gleaming like a polished statue, might be admired visually, but medical authorities would whisper behind the scenes that their humours were in danger of scattering. Children, notably, were often left dirty on purpose. Parents believed that a child too frequently washed would become fragile, prone to cold, illness, or weakness. Dirt toughened them. Dirt closed them. Dirt made small bodies more resilient. Many childhood ailments were blamed not on contamination, but on over-cleansing, removing the protective barrier the child needed to resist cold or harmful influences. If your baby was too clean, clearly you were being careless. Travellers in particular learned to embrace grime. Roads were rough, inns were inconsistent, and weather was unforgiving. Keeping clean was nearly impossible, and more importantly seen as unnecessary. A traveller who remained dirty throughout their journey actually believed themselves safer. Dirt shielded them from exposure to unfamiliar climates or strange mists in foreign valleys. Washing on the road was considered almost reckless. Worse, it risked washing away the very layer that kept illness at bay. This concept of protective dirt extended into certain occupations as well. Miners, smiths, millers, charcoal burners, and shepherds all spent their lives surrounded by substances that coated the skin. Rather than washing them off constantly, many believed those layers, soot, charcoal dust, flour, lanolin, or clay, functioned as protective skins. Removing them unnecessarily was as foolish as removing clothing on a cold day. Even household tasks reinforced the belief. Washing pots, scrubbing floors, and maintaining the hearth all involved dealing with dirt, soot, and ash. Medieval people observed that those tasks, messy as they were, rarely resulted in illness, while the times they experienced sickness often followed periods of overexposure to moisture or drastic temperature changes. The conclusion seemed obvious. Dirt did not harm them, water did. And then there was the symbolic dimension. Dirt connected people to their environment. Medieval society revolved around nature's cycles, agricultural rhythms, and the belief that human beings belong to the earth spiritually as well as physically. To carry a bit of that earth on your body wasn't disgraceful. It was grounding. It marked your place within the natural order, the community, and the occupational fabric of life. The religious imagination didn't fully reject dirt either. Many holy figures, the desert hermits, barefoot monks, ascetics, embraced filth as a sign of humility and spiritual dedication. Dirt became associated with piety, discipline, and endurance. If holy people avoided washing, surely dirt had virtue. Yet beneath spiritual and symbolic interpretations lay the practical core. People noticed they felt colder, weaker, and more vulnerable when excessively washed. They connected this experience with illness and therefore avoided it. Dirt became not a burden, but a buffer. So the medieval person walked through life armoured not only in wool, leather or metal, but in the earth itself. Dirt was their insulation, their protection, their natural shield against a world full of unpredictable forces. To them, filth was not failure. Filth was not shame. Filth was not danger. Filth was armour. If you ever feel guilty about a child returning home covered in mud, medieval parents would like you to relax. They would have considered that child perfectly on track. In the Middle Ages, children didn't simply encounter dirt. They grew up with it, internalized it, accepted it, and eventually adopted it as a normal condition of life. Cleanliness was not a virtue taught in childhood. Dirt was not a problem to be solved. Dirt was the backdrop for growing up, a texture of everyday experience, and in many ways part of a child's informal education. From the moment they could crawl, medieval children interacted with the world physically, directly, and without modern barriers. They crawled on dirt floors, played in dusty yards, tumbled in fields, and sat in workshops where parents hammered, spun, dyed, cured, cooked, and crafted. Floors were strewn with rushes or straw that trapped every crumb, every spill, and every unidentifiable substance from the last few months. Babies learned to balance on uneven surfaces, patches of cold earth and layers of plant matter that had absorbed far more history than modern rugs ever will. If a child licked a floorboard, and history suggests many did, it was seen as one of those things children do, not a call for emergency sanitation. Clothing habits reinforced the experience. Children rarely had multiple outfits, and those they owned were frequently repurposed, patched, or borrowed from older siblings. A child's garment might be washed only occasionally, and usually when it crossed the threshold from dirty to even we have limits. Wearing the same tunic for days or weeks wasn't strange. It was expected. A stained shirt didn't reflect poor parenting. It reflected the reality that washing clothes was labour-intensive, water was unreliable, and children were, by nature, uncooperative in staying clean for more than 7 consecutive seconds. Parents didn't coach children toward cleanliness because cleanliness wasn't considered health-preserving or morally important. Instead, children learned that filth was simply part of their environment. They were taught to tolerate discomfort, endure weather, and function while dusty, sweaty, or speckled with the day's activities. Dirt toughened them, or so adults believed. Overcleaning a child was thought to risk making them delicate, a dangerous flaw in a world that rewarded resilience. The lack of germ theory further shaped childhood behaviours. Parents didn't enforce hand-washing before meals because they didn't see hands as vehicles of invisible contagion. Children shared food, toys, and drinking vessels with no more concern than a flock of sparrows sharing a bird bath. They passed objects between mouths, explored their surroundings with hands and teeth alike, and handled animals with infectious enthusiasm. A goose might nip them, a dog might slobber on them, and a chicken might flap into them, and none of this prompted a bath. Bathing routines for children were minimal and mostly symbolic. A child might be rinsed off after an unusually messy accident or on special occasions, but daily bathing was unimaginable. Not only was warm water scarce, But parents feared the chill a wet child might experience afterward far more than the dirt they accumulated beforehand. Wet hair was risky. Damp clothing was dangerous. Cold drafts were to be avoided at all costs. Dirt, by contrast, never caused a fever. Children themselves embraced filth with gusto. Play was entirely outdoors or in workspaces, not in sanitized indoor environments. A child's daily adventures involved mud, puddles, sticks, hay, tools, animals, insects, and a rotating cast of questionable natural substances. Toddlers might toddle straight into a pigsty or sheep pen. Young boys clambered up trees, waded in creeks, or rolled down hills. Girls helped with chores that involved flour dust, wool fibres, spilled milk, or soot from cooking fires. Dirt wasn't a problem. Dirt was infrastructure. Culturally, dirt didn't carry moral weight. Cleanliness wasn't framed as next to godliness. That idea wouldn't fully take hold until far later. What mattered for children was obedience, industry, modesty, and reverence, not whether they tracked mud into the house. A clean child wasn't praised. A hard-working or well-behaved child was. Appearance mattered only in church or at major feasts, when parents might give their children their less dirty clothing, smooth their hair, and tell them not to touch anything on the way there. Practical childcare also normalised dirt. Diapers as we know them didn't exist. Infants were wrapped in swaddling cloths, changed when obviously necessary, and kept warm rather than spotless. Toddlers often went without underclothes, meaning accidents happened wherever accidents happened. Cleanup was basic. No one expected lemon-scented sterilisation. By the time children reached adolescence, they had already internalized an unspoken philosophy. The world is messy, and so am I. They didn't crave cleanliness because they had never known it as a constant condition. When they became adults, their attitudes toward bathing, washing clothes, or using perfumes followed naturally from their upbringing. Dirt was normal. Dirt was safe. Dirt was the texture of life. In a world where survival demanded resilience rather than hygiene, medieval childhood operated as a slow initiation into the realities of adulthood. Children were trained not in cleanliness, but in tolerance, for mud, for labour, for discomfort, for life's unpredictable and often unscented challenges. Because in medieval society, childhood wasn't messy, it was educational. In the modern world, taking a bath can signal anything from relaxation to, "I'm treating myself tonight." In the medieval world, however, taking a bath signaled something very different. "I am unwell. Please pray for me." Bathing was not a normal part of daily life. It was a medical intervention, performed reluctantly, cautiously, and usually under the assumption that something inside your body had malfunctioned and now required watery persuasion to fix it. To be seen heading to a bathhouse or requesting warm water was not a sign of hygiene. It was an admission that your body had betrayed you. Medieval physicians treated baths the way modern doctors treat prescription medication, rarely, carefully, and only when symptoms demanded it. You did not take a bath because you wanted to. You took one because your physician insisted, and even then, you probably argued. Baths were prescribed for specific conditions, such as fevers, joint stiffness, gout, digestive trouble, melancholy, and various blockages of the humours. Water, especially warm water, was believed to move or loosen the internal fluids that medieval medicine centred around. A bath might encourage sweating, ease tension, or coax stubborn humours back into circulation. But because bathing altered the body's temperature and opened the pores, it was considered too destabilising for the healthy. Healthy bodies needed to stay sealed, balanced, and warm, not relaxed, moistened, and vulnerable. Bathing was disruptive. Disruption was dangerous. So the presence of a bath in your schedule meant your humours were misbehaving badly enough that controlled water exposure was the least risky option. Even then, baths were heavily regulated. Physicians specified the temperature, the duration, the herbs to infuse, the time of day, the diet beforehand, and the necessary precautions afterward. A bath wasn't a cleansing event, it was a treatment session. You might be instructed to sit only waist deep, or only immerse your legs, or only soak in lukewarm water mixed with chamomile, rose, fennel, or vinegar. Full immersion was considered dramatic and rarely recommended unless your condition was truly dire, a medieval aquatic last resort. Because baths were so associated with illness, people who bathed frequently were viewed with suspicion or concern. Why were they bathing so often? What was wrong with them? What exactly were they trying to cure? A man who requested repeated baths risked being labelled weak, fragile, or afflicted with some lingering condition. A woman who bathed too frequently might be accused of vanity, or even secretly treating an illness she didn't want the community to know about. Clean skin wasn't a sign of good health, it was a sign of ongoing health problems. This medical framing also shaped emotional reactions to bathing. If you had to take a bath, you were likely already uncomfortable, feverish, or aching. The bath was a chore you endured for the sake of recovery, not a soothing soak with medieval spa music, which to be fair would have been a solitary flute played badly by a neighbour's child. The water might contain strong-smelling herbs, oils, or minerals intended to treat specific ailments. Some medicinal baths were more like steeping yourself in a witch's cauldron than relaxing in warm water. And because baths required effort, fuel, and sometimes professional oversight, the whole household would be aware that you were unwell. The connection between bathing and sickness became self-reinforcing. People noticed that bathing often occurred during illness, so they developed the impression that bathing caused illness. When someone in the community took a bath and later fell sick, it wasn't a leap of logic, it was a confirmation of what everyone already believed. Water weakened the body. The bath didn't just treat the illness, the bath summoned it. Even when physicians insisted on bathing for recovery, those around the patient watched nervously, hoping the cure wasn't worse than the disease. Public bathhouses reinforced this link. While bathhouses had many uses, socializing, grooming, dining, visiting one during illness was common. People suffering from chronic problems, injuries, rashes, or stiffness flocked to the baths hoping to find relief in warm water. This meant the bathhouse was often full of people with ailments. And when you fill a building with sick people, even in the absence of germ theory, the building itself becomes symbolically associated with sickness. People didn't avoid bathhouses solely because they feared moral risk or water contamination. They avoided them because that's where the sick people went. And so, healthy individuals kept their distance. They did not want to soak in the same tub as someone recovering from an ailment. They did not want to mingle with weakened bodies. They did not want to encounter whatever mysterious forces were afflicting others. Staying away from baths was not laziness. It was self-preservation. Medicinal bathing also intersected with social expectations. A healthy person simply didn't have time to indulge in something as frivolous or suspicious as a bath. Daily life was labour-intensive, and bathing required significant preparation. Why waste energy boiling water, fetching herbs, and heating a room if no health crisis demanded it? Work came first. Cleanliness came never, unless someone was coughing hard enough to worry the household. Thus, medieval people built an unspoken rule into their cultural logic. If you were bathing, something had gone wrong. It meant your body was imbalanced. It meant your humours were misaligned. It meant you had reason to fear drafts, chills, and unexpected outcomes. Bathing was not for the strong. Bathing was for the suffering. Bathing was for the sick. And every person who stepped into a tub understood the silent message it sent. This is serious enough that I am risking water. In the Middle Ages, society wasn't just divided by wealth or privilege. It was divided by appearance, clothing, posture, accent, diet, and even the smell of a person helped reinforce a finely tuned hierarchy. Everyone was supposed to look their part. A noble was expected to shine, in clothing, if not in personal hygiene. A merchant needed to appear respectable. A labourer was expected to carry the dust of the fields, and a peasant? A peasant was expected to look like the land itself had raised them and claimed them. Cleanliness didn't simply improve a person's appearance, it threatened the system that kept medieval society stable. In a world built on visual cues, dirt kept everyone in their place. Medieval people relied heavily on outward appearance to judge social rank. There were no business cards, no resumes, and no convenient ID cards. You recognized someone's status by their clothes, their posture, their speech, and yes, by how clean they appeared. Cleanliness was associated with privilege. Only certain classes had the time, the resources, and the living conditions that allowed a person to appear polished. When someone from a lower class seemed disproportionately clean, it created confusion. And confusion was dangerous in a society obsessed with order. For peasants, dirt wasn't simply unavoidable, it was expected. Their lives revolved around agricultural labour, animal care, construction, transport, or craft work. Sweat, dust, mud, soot, and plant matter clung to them as naturally as breathing. A farm labourer emerging spotless from a full day of work was not just suspicious, it was nearly impossible. Dirt was the uniform of the working class. Cleanliness, therefore, hinted at idleness. A clean peasant immediately raised questions. Why aren't you working? Who are you trying to impress? What rule are you breaking? And for nobles, the opposite was true. A visibly dirty noble risked appearing incompetent, bankrupt, or socially diminished. Cleanliness was part of the performance of status. Fresh linens, scented oils, carefully arranged hair, and pristine garments. A noble smelling like a barnyard suggested something had gone very wrong in their finances or habits. Nobles weren't expected to sweat unless they were hunting, jousting, or dying heroically on a battlefield. Cleanliness assured the world that wealth and power were functioning exactly as intended. So when people from different classes began to resemble one another in cleanliness, the system shook. If a peasant washed too often, they risked looking aspirational, and aspiration was dangerous. It blurred the rigid lines medieval society depended on. Authority figures, landowners, clergy, guild leaders did not appreciate signs of upward mimicry. Cleanliness could make a peasant appear more refined, more respectable, or more prepared for social advancement, which threatened those above them who relied on visual cues to maintain dominance. This anxiety intensified in urban environments where social classes rubbed shoulders more frequently. A cobbler who appeared too polished might be mistaken for a merchant. A merchant who looked dishevelled might be mistaken for a labourer. Society relied on instant visual sorting, and excessive personal cleanliness made that sorting harder. Medieval towns thrived on clarity, knowing who owed taxes, who could give orders, who deserved respect, and who could be ignored. Cleanliness scrambled those signals like a medieval form of social camouflage. Clothing laws, sumptuary laws, reinforced this idea. These regulations dictated who could wear what. Fabrics, colours, accessories, and even types of fur were restricted by class. These laws didn't typically address bathing directly, but they reflected the same underlying fear. People might use appearance to transcend their assigned status. Cleanliness fell into the same category of dangerous self-elevation. A clean peasant might not be breaking any written law, but they were breaking an unwritten one. Know your place. Even among the middle classes, moderation was key. A merchant who bathed too much risked appearing decadent or wasteful. Excessive washing signalled luxury, and luxury hinted at ambition. Those below resented it. Those above feared it. Medieval society worked best when no one appeared to be rising or falling too quickly. There was also a practical aspect. Clean people smelled different, and in a society accustomed to the scent of smoke, sweat, and livestock, smelling different was a kind of social statement. Perfumery, aromatic oils, and scented clothing accessories were often associated with the wealthy. If someone of a lower status began adopting these scents, they were making a claim to refinement that others might perceive as provocative. A farmer smelling faintly of lavender wasn't charming, he was presumptuous. Cleanliness also signalled free time. In a world where survival required constant labour, only the privileged had hours available for bathing, grooming, changing linens, or heating water. If a labourer appeared clean, it meant they had taken time away from work, which could imply laziness, rebellion, or unearned luxury. Dirt, by contrast, was a badge of productivity. To be dirty was to be socially correct. To be clean was to disrupt expectations. Even the church played a role. Medieval clergy preached humility, and excessive attention to grooming was criticised as vanity. Cleanliness had moral implications. Too much of it suggested pride, flamboyance, or temptation. But this messaging applied differently across classes. A noble who bathed was preserving dignity. A peasant who bathed too much appeared pretentious. In short, medieval cleanliness didn't operate in a vacuum. It operated in a hierarchy. Cleanliness could elevate. Cleanliness could deceive. Cleanliness could challenge the visual language of power. And so society protected itself through a simple rule. Let nobles look noble. Let workers look worked. Let peasants look earthy. Everyone's place remained legible as long as filth was predictable, because in medieval society, dirt kept everyone in their place. If there is one truth that shaped medieval life more than any other, it is this. Survival took time, an enormous, unrelenting amount of time. Every day required effort simply to exist. Food didn't appear in stores, water didn't flow from taps, clothing didn't arrive folded in drawers, warmth didn't radiate from walls. Everything required labour, and that labour consumed nearly every waking hour. In such a world, bathing wasn't simply inconvenient, it was impractical. Cleanliness didn't feed you, shelter you, or defend you. Soap was optional. Survival was not. Consider the daily rhythm of a medieval household. Before dawn, fires must be rekindled if they hadn't gone out during the night, which they often did. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooking, no boiling water, no protection. Kindling had to be gathered, wood had to be chopped, and the fire had to be coaxed into life with techniques modern people would only attempt under emergency circumstances or reality TV pressure. Then came food. Bread didn't come sliced. It came from hours of grinding, kneading, rising, and baking. Vegetables required harvesting, washing, peeling, and cooking. Meat needed salting, drying, or stewing. Every meal consumed energy like a hungry beast. For those who lived by agriculture or craft work, the day's labour began early and ended late, and there was no clock to punch out from. Cows didn't milk themselves. Wool didn't spin itself. Fields didn't plough themselves. Even on good days, life overflowed with tasks that could not be postponed. So where, exactly, in this marathon of daily effort was a medieval person supposed to fit in a bath? Bathing required time, privacy, fuel, water, and preparation. Even small-scale washing was labour-intensive. Fetching water meant walking to the nearest source, hauling heavy buckets back to the house, and hoping you didn't slip on mud or ice along the way. Heating water meant burning precious firewood, which itself demanded labour to cut and gather. Once water was ready, washing consumed even more time. Time that couldn't be spent spinning, weaving, tending livestock, preparing meals, watching children, or earning wages. In short, time spent on bathing was time not spent on survival, and survival didn't wait. Weather could ruin crops, illness could ravage families, a poor harvest meant hunger, a broken tool meant days of lost work, life balanced on the narrow edge of scarcity. Medieval people didn't avoid soap because they disliked cleanliness. They avoided it because life left little room for anything that didn't directly contribute to keeping a roof overhead and enough food in the pot to avoid starvation. For peasants, who made up the majority of the population, the stakes were even higher. They lived under obligations to landlords, taxes to the crown, and the constant pressure of producing enough to feed both their families and the administrative systems above them. A sudden storm might force them to work longer hours to salvage crops. Animals might require urgent care. A broken cart axle or snapped plough chain could send an entire day spiralling into unexpected labour. In such conditions, personal grooming was an indulgence only the foolish entertained. Even for artisans and tradespeople in towns, time equalled income. Every moment spent bathing was a moment not spent working leather, hammering iron, shaping wood, dyeing cloth, or grinding grain. A day lost to cleanliness was a day of lost profit, lost trust from customers, and lost standing in guild communities where productivity equalled reputation. Women carried perhaps the greatest daily burden. Household management involved an endless list of tasks: cooking, cleaning, in a medieval sense, not a modern one, child rearing, mending clothes, preparing food stores, milking animals, tending gardens, weaving cloth, making candles, and serving extended family members. Bathing wasn't simply about the woman taking time for herself. It required reorganizing the workflow of everyone around her. Heating water for a full bath could disrupt the household's entire routine, and of course medieval people didn't bathe alone. Children needed to be watched, animals needed to be fed, fires needed tending. Even a brief period of being wet and vulnerable was risky, especially in cold seasons when a draft could undo days of careful health maintenance. Dirt didn't cause sickness. Neglecting necessary daily work did. This prioritization extended beyond the home. Communities functioned on cooperative labor. Neighbors shared tools, helped with harvests, and built communal structures. Everyone had responsibilities. If someone skipped work for something as frivolous as I felt like washing, they disrupted these cooperative systems. Bathing wasn't merely a personal choice, it was a deviation from group expectations. Nobles and wealthy merchants had more time, but even they didn't spend it bathing frequently. Their days involved managing estates, attending councils, entertaining guests, overseeing servants, settling disputes, and engaging in travel across rough roads and unpredictable weather. Bathing still required preparation, fuel, attendance, and space. And even wealthy households recognized that firewood wasn't infinite, servants weren't tireless, and a bath wasn't worth sacrificing more essential work. In medieval thinking, labor equaled virtue, industry equaled survival, and cleanliness, unfortunately, equaled neither. So medieval people developed an intuitive understanding that cleanliness wasn't merely optional, it was secondary. It wasn't a necessity. It wasn't a marker of moral worth. It wasn't a sign of intelligence, discipline, or responsibility. Cleanliness was simply nice. And when nice things compete with survival, survival wins every time. Soap did not help plough fields. Soap did not fill grain stores. Soap did not heat homes in winter, and so medieval people chose dirt not out of negligence, but out of practicality. Because in their world, cleanliness didn't feed you, it distracted you. It would be comforting to imagine that after the Black Death, after watching entire neighbourhoods vanish, after burying friends, relatives, employers, customers, and clergy, medieval people collectively stood up, dusted off their tunics, and declared, "All right then, time for better hygiene." But that is not what happened. The plague may have altered Europe's population, economy, and worldview, but personal cleanliness? That took centuries. Trauma changes habits only when people understand what caused the trauma. And in the 14th century, Europe had absolutely no idea what had happened to them. You cannot change a habit when you don't know what the habit is supposed to accomplish. And in medieval logic, washing had no link to disease prevention. If bathing didn't stop fevers, didn't prevent miasma, didn't repel evil spirits, didn't fix humoral imbalances, and didn't guarantee anything except the risk of catching a chill, why would people suddenly start doing it after a catastrophe? If anything, many feared bathing even more after the plague. Clean skin meant open pores. Open pores meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in the medieval worldview meant illness. The plague's arrival felt less like an environmental crisis and more like divine judgment, mysterious poisoning, astrological misalignment, or bad air sweeping across the land. People blame the stars, the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter, foul winds drifting from distant lands, corrupted air rising from marshes, or the wrath of God. Some blamed outsiders or strangers. Some blamed personal sin. No one blamed dirty hands. Without a cause, there could be no solution. And without a solution, daily habits remained exactly what they had always been. Moreover, the plague struck too fast for habits to change, even if people had wanted them to. Entire communities fell before anyone had time to reconsider their morning routines. A medieval bather might, in some grim hypothetical, stand up from a rare spa day, wrap themselves in linen, and immediately spot the telltale buboes under their arms. A habit cannot adapt to something that kills before anyone has time to adjust. The plague moved like a storm. Cultural shifts move like glaciers. When the immediate crisis passed, daily survival reasserted itself. Those who remained had to rebuild households, repopulate farms, repair buildings, replant crops, reclaim lost animals, and navigate massive labour shortages. Cleanliness, as always, ranked below everything else, and now there was even more urgent work to do. If bathing had distracted people from survival before, it certainly wasn't going to win new popularity in the aftermath of societal collapse. Even attempts to respond to the plague often reinforced old habits. Physicians, trying to make sense of the catastrophe, doubled down on humoral logic. They warned against overheating the body. They advised people to avoid baths, avoid hot foods, avoid exertion, avoid opening the skin to bad air. Bathing was declared risky not because of disease transmission, but because a relaxed, moist, warm body was thought to absorb corrupted air more easily. Bathing didn't save you from plague. Bathing invited it. The logic was flawed, but it was consistent, and consistency wins in times of fear. Communities also clung to ritual and tradition, anchors in a world that had abruptly stopped behaving. Washing more often would have required not only extra labour but a rethinking of the world's basic logic. That kind of philosophical overhaul doesn't happen because of disaster, it happens because of science. Medieval Europe had disaster in abundance but almost no science, and even when plague returned, and it did again and again, people developed responses that required no changes to hygiene at all. They fled cities, they burned incense, they quarantined ships, they shut gates, they avoided strangers, they prayed, they blamed, they rationed, they built plague pits. Every solution targeted the world around them, not themselves. Their bodies were not the battlefield, they were the victims. Daily habits remained tethered to practicality. Bathhouses, already under suspicion for moral and medical reasons, closed or fell into disuse. Not because people suddenly embraced personal hygiene as a safety measure, but because bathhouses were crowded, intimate, and associated with sinners, foreigners, and the sick. Avoiding the bathhouse was an act of fear, not cleanliness, and so the world moved forward without truly changing its hygiene habits. The trauma was immense, but trauma without comprehension does not produce prevention. Even after millions died, medieval people still believed bad air caused sickness, God allowed sickness, cleanliness had nothing to do with it. If anything, the plague reinforced their fear of exposing the skin. Dirt still mattered more than soap. Warmth still mattered more than washing. A sealed body still mattered more than a clean one. The path to modern hygiene would take centuries more, through Renaissance medicine, Enlightenment science, the discovery of microorganisms, and the eventual realization that invisible agents had been pulling the strings all along. Until then, people simply continued as they always had. Because even catastrophe needs instructions, and medieval Europe didn't receive them. To understand why medieval people avoided bathing, you must first understand that medieval privacy, as a concept, as a value, as a physical possibility, barely existed. Most people lived in houses that were closer to busy campsites than modern homes. Families, children, animals, visitors, neighbours, apprentices, servants, and the occasional wandering chicken all shared the same few rooms. Life unfolded in overlapping layers of sound, movement, labour, and conversation. And in such a crowded environment, the idea of taking your clothes off and scrubbing yourself in peace was less a practical activity and more a whimsical fantasy. Put simply, you can't bathe when someone's making soup beside you. The typical medieval home, peasant or modest urban dwelling, consisted of 1 or 2 rooms, 1 room if you were average, 2 rooms if you were lucky, a loft above the main area if you were really lucky. The main room served every purpose: cooking, eating, working, storing tools, drying herbs, entertaining guests, disciplining children, repairing clothing, spinning wool, preparing meals, sleeping, and yes, occasionally bathing. But because that room was always busy, bathing became an activity that had to compete with literally every other part of survival. If someone needed to cook, the fire took precedence. If someone needed to mend clothes, the best light was needed. If children were underfoot, which they always were, parents couldn't simply announce, "Clear the room, I'm washing." There was nowhere to clear to. Even if a family wanted to give one person privacy, there was often nowhere else for the others to go. Outside might be cold, muddy, unsafe, full of animals, or full of neighbours who are not known for minding their own business. Even the wealthier households with multiple rooms and more substantial layouts struggled with privacy. Servants moved constantly through halls and chambers. Apprentices slept near their masters. Family members shared beds for warmth. Walls were thin. Doors were rare. A wealthy person could commission a bath, but they could not guarantee solitude. Bathing required attendants to carry water, tend the fire, fetch towels, heat more water, or stabilize the cumbersome wooden tubs. Privacy wasn't a benefit of wealth. It was simply less impossible. And let's consider the logistics of bathing indoors. To bathe, you needed space for a tub, which had to be moved from storage and positioned near the fire. Then dozens of buckets of water needed to be hauled inside, heated, poured, reheated, topped up and maintained. Water splashed. Floors became slippery. Mud turned to sludge. A bath created a household event, not a personal moment. Everyone knew it was happening. Everyone had to maneuver around it. Everyone had to accept that the house's central space was now partially occupied by someone sitting in a wooden bucket pretending this was relaxing. Nothing about this process offered privacy. Even changing clothes lacked secrecy. Families dressed and undressed in common spaces, children bathed together, and adults rarely enjoyed solitary grooming. For many households, the only moments of relative privacy happened when people stepped outside to relieve themselves, or when they died. Bathing also carried moral implications that privacy made more complicated. Medieval culture valued modesty, especially for women. Exposing the body, even to one's own family, was not considered casual. To undress in the same room where others were cooking or praying or repairing harness straps felt improper. And yet, because homes lacked the architectural structure to create separate bathing rooms, the only solutions involved screens, fabric partitions, or temporary barriers. These were flimsy at best, expensive at worst, and often unusable in tiny living spaces. Imagine hanging a wool blanket around yourself to serve as a changing area. While the room fills with smoke, children run in and out. Your dog tries to inspect the tub and your neighbour arrives unannounced because doors weren't considered private barriers so much as suggestions. Privacy wasn't a right. It wasn't a resource. It wasn't even a realistic desire. A medieval life was noisy, constantly noisy. Work clattered, animals bleated, pots boiled, wind howled through uneven walls, and conversations overlapped in chaotic layers. Bathing demanded concentration, vulnerability, and a few precious moments of stillness. 3 qualities that medieval homes enthusiastically rejected. You might begin your bath feeling optimistic, only to find your moment shattered by someone returning with firewood, someone dropping flour, someone asking where the ladle went, someone's toddler wandering under the curtain, asking deep philosophical questions, someone's cow deciding this is a good moment to moo directly into the wall. Even communal bathing, which might seem like a privacy-free but functional alternative, required travel, payment, and exposure to unfamiliar eyes. Bathhouses offered warmth, but not modesty. They were social spaces, bustling with people, noises, and activities. If privacy was the goal, the bathhouse was the opposite of a solution. The church further complicated the issue. Religious authorities frequently warned against nudity and moral corruption in public baths, but bathing at home lacked privacy too. So the medieval person wound up caught between moral pressure not to be seen washing and practical pressure not to wash at all. Privacy became a paradox. You needed privacy to bathe, but lacking privacy was one of the reasons you didn't bathe in the first place. And so the simplest solution prevailed. Just don't bathe very often. It avoided awkwardness, it avoided moral suspicion, it avoided logistical chaos, it avoided the entire household having to rearrange the geography of the home. Medieval living spaces were built for survival, not comfort. They were communal, crowded, and constantly in use. Bathing required isolation, an environmental luxury the medieval world could not supply. In a home where life unfolded openly, publicly, collectively, and loudly, cleanliness simply couldn't compete. Because in the Middle Ages, you can't bathe when someone's making soup beside you. After travelling through 23 chapters of grime, drafts, parasites, cold water, suspicious physicians, judgmental neighbours, traumatised post-plague communities, and bathing rituals that required the logistical coordination of a minor military campaign, one truth becomes clear. Medieval people were not avoiding cleanliness because they were foolish. They were avoiding it because it made sense. To live in the Middle Ages was to occupy a world built on different assumptions: practical, medical, environmental, social, and spiritual frameworks that shaped what people believed about their bodies and the dangers they faced. Cleanliness was not a straightforward virtue. It was a negotiation with reality. Let's revisit the world in which medieval people operated. Water wasn't clean. Houses weren't warm. Drafts weren't harmless. Soap wasn't accessible. Bathing was associated with the sick, the sinful, or the socially suspect. Pores, in the medieval imagination, were open doors for danger. Dirt was insulation. Public baths were germ banks before germs had even been invented. And bathing required privacy, time, labour, money, and fuel. 5 things medieval people rarely had all at once. Add to this the fact that survival overshadowed comfort. Every day required strenuous physical effort just to stay fed, warm, and sheltered. Bathing wasn't a refreshing extra. It was a liability. And when resources are scarce, liabilities get cut first. Modern hygiene, by contrast, is supported by technologies medieval people couldn't imagine. Germ theory, indoor plumbing, temperature control, widespread fuel, private bathrooms, synthetic soap, disposable towels, and water that doesn't double as a biography of your community's agricultural runoff. We have the luxury of linking hygiene with health. Medieval people did not. They lived in a world where cleanliness did not equal survival, but where avoiding it often did. Medieval people feared cold more than dirt, drafts more than sweat, bad air more than grime, and weakened bodies more than unscented ones. Their logic wasn't ours, but it was consistent with their environment. A modern person, dropped into a medieval home in January, would strip off their ideals of daily showers within 48 hours, likely after the first time their wet hair froze into a small regrettable crown. And their concerns weren't always unfounded. Bathing could be dangerous in winter. Public baths were sites of disease transmission. Wells and rivers were contaminated. Overexposure could weaken the immune defences they understood through humours, not biology. Clean skin did lose heat faster. Their bodies, their tools, and their beliefs all pointed toward the same conclusion: stay dry, stay warm, stay sealed. Cleanliness was a luxury, yes, but more importantly, it was a risk. a risk many people couldn't afford. Even culturally, avoiding excessive cleanliness maintained order. Dirt marked your labour. Dirt signalled humility. Dirt confirmed your role. Cleanliness blurred lines, invited suspicion, or implied idleness. Remaining slightly dirty meant remaining socially correct. And spiritually, filth wasn't inherently sinful. Pride was, vanity was, excess was. Washing for necessity, acceptable. Washing for pleasure, morally questionable. Washing too often, potentially dangerous to body and soul. Medieval Christianity valued restraint, moderation, and the avoidance of sensual indulgence. Bathing, especially luxurious bathing, risked grazing the borders of temptation. So you can see how a medieval person, flooded with practical inconveniences, medical warnings, social expectations, and environmental hostility, might reasonably conclude bathing is more trouble than it's worth, and they weren't wrong, not in their context. Within the logic of medieval life, hygiene avoidance was not a failure. It was a survival strategy, a way to stay healthy, productive, socially acceptable, morally secure, and physically intact. We judge them now because we have microscopes, plumbing, antibacterial gel, and thermostats. But they weren't idiots. They were strategists in a world that offered few comforts and many threats. And in that world, they adapted expertly. In the Middle Ages, you survived not because you were spotless, but because you were sturdy, warm, and layered in the protective embrace of everyday filth. And so our journey ends with the most medieval truth of all. The good news, you survived medieval life. The bad news, you did it dirty.